Chapter 8. Revolt of the Miners. West Virginia, 1912–1913. Despite years of organizing activity by the United Mine Workers, in 1912, thousands of coal miners still lived under conditions not far removed from medieval feudalism. The mine operators also owned the surrounding land upon which they erected company-owned dwellings and stores. To work in the mines, a laborer also had to live in a rented company home and do his purchasing at the company grocery and dry goods stores. The miner who protested lost simultaneously his job, his dwelling and his right to remain in the community. 1. Probably more than any other important mining state, West Virginia urgently needed effective organization to protect the lives and interests of her coal miners. Engaged in one of the most dangerous occupations, they had to endure short coal waits, payments in company scrip, poor housing, low wages, inadequate medical attention, a system of blacklisting, brutal company guards, and high company store prices which kept them constantly in debt. A state investigating committee found, in many instances, an overcharge ranging from 10 to 25% at company stores. One student of the West Virginia mines concludes that for the miners, a system of peonage existed. 2. When the miners did obtain some relief from the legislative bodies, the courts invariably wiped out their gains. The West Virginia courts denied the miners the right to be paid in cash and refused to uphold the law which prohibited the mine owners from selling to the laborers at a higher price than outsiders. The court stated that these laws represented unjust interference with private contracts and business, and that they were an insulting attempt to put the laborer under legislative tutelage, which was degrading to his manhood, and suppressive of his rights as a citizen of the United States. 3. So the companies continued to use the scrip system of wage payment and to compel their employees to trade at company stores. In the summer of 1911, Teresa Malkiel, a socialist organizer, visited the mine regions of West Virginia. She wrote in the New York Call of August 27, 1911. The company owns the shacks in which the miners live all along the line for about 20 miles, and when a man offends in the least, he not on. Why loses his job, but has to move, the man cannot find shelter anywhere along the line nor any work even in the adjoining mines. If you bear in mind that the miner seldom sees any cash and has no means to go elsewhere, you can realize in what state of abject slavery the miners are kept. They are paid by the month and having no cash must buy the provisions from the company store and pay %% more for every article. A miner, his wife and baby get a bill for groceries amounting to $45 per month, and they do not get enough to keep body and soul together. A year and a half later, the conservative New York Tribune confirmed the accuracy of this report. If anywhere in the world men need organizing to protect their interests, it is in the West Virginia mining district. In the West Virginia coal fields, the mine operators are the landlords, the local merchants for the miners trade at the company stores, and they are very much of the local government so far as there is any in those mountains. Indeed, they have always been a large part of the state government, too. Each way the miner turns, he comes up against the employing corporation. When he rents a house, it must beat the company's terms. When he buys food and clothing, he must pay the company's PNCES. And when he seeks his legal rights, it must be from the authorities that are likely to be subservient to the great local industries. It is a species of industrial feudalism to which he is subjected. 4. Exercising their right of private ownership, the operators employed guards who would not permit union organizers to come near the mines and would not even allow meetings of the miners. The guards permitted no one to visit the mines or mine villages or even to walk along the roads leading to the villages unless his business was known. Strangers were stopped and asked their business. 5. Organizing the miners was made still more difficult by the fact that towns were isolated and often inaccessible because of the rugged terrain, each constituting a little world within itself. 6. Another factor retarding union growth was the ability of the anti-union employers to capitalize on race prejudice. The United Mine Workers adhered to the policy of organizing both white and black workers into the same local, and this was played up by the companies in order to create hostility to the union among white miners. most of whom were either native mountaineers or recent immigrants. The fact that many Afro-Americans were brought into the state from the South as strikebreakers, often without their knowledge, also increased racial friction and antagonism. 7. The unorganized status of the mines in West Virginia constituted a threat to both the United Mine Workers and the stability of the industry. The state's coal companies competed in both the Eastern and Great Lakes markets. Because of the union, Midwestern operators were paying higher wages and had been forced to eliminate many of the miners' long-standing grievances. In West Virginia, on the other hand, the company store, excessive docking, the absence of checkweighmen appointed by the miners, oversized mine cars, and the longer hours of work all enabled the operators to sell their coal at a lower price. This, of course, was a constant threat to the organized coal fields. Not only did the non-union status of the industry attract operators to West Virginia, but even those with UMW contracts made it a practice to own mines in the state, so that they could shift operations from the union mines whenever they were threatened with a strike. Although the Union began its attempts to organize West Virginia as early as 1885, it made no headway worth mentioning. Nevertheless, beginning with 1898, at each Union Convention and Joint State Conference, the delegates pointed to the need to organize West Virginia and warned that the UMW would remain weak until this was accomplished. John Mitchell told the delegates to a convention, "You cannot be permanently safe, you cannot rest in security until West Virginia is organized." 9. In spite of the vigilance of both the operators and their guards, a widespread organizing campaign was begun in 1901 which produced about 80 locals with approximately 5,000 members. At this point, the UMW felt strong enough to call a general strike for statewide recognition, and on June 7, 1902, the strike call went out. More than 16,000 miners in the Kanawha, New River, Norfolk, and Western districts responded and walked out. But the miners were defeated in all but one section by a combination of the eviction of strikers from their homes, the repression by the mine guards and National Guardsmen, the use of strikebreakers and injunctions, and the arrest of their national organizers, including the legendary Mother, Mary Jones and Thomas Haggerty. Mother Jones was 50 years old when she took up the cause of labor, and she soon became known as Mother, from Arnott, Pennsylvania to Cripple Creek, Colorado. Her courage in labor struggles took on the quality of a folk legend. In the strike of 1902 in West Virginia, she was arrested and imprisoned, charged with inciting riots. An injunction had been issued to prevent her from speaking, but as usual, she defied the courts. Although the miners of the New River, Norfolk, and Western districts lost their strike, those in the Kanawha section managed to win an agreement which included a 9-hour day, the election of checkweighmen to watch the weighing of the coal to see that miners received their fair weight, semi-monthly pay days, a reduction in the price of powder, the right to trade at non-company stores, and no discrimination in rehiring the strikers or for union affiliation. In addition, the check-off was included, and the coal companies agreed to collect dues owed by the miners to their union and to transmit them to the UMW.10. In 1904, the only organized mining district in West Virginia suffered a setback when a strike over the issue of the check-off ended in a defeat. 11 Nevertheless, the Union, increasing threatened by the expanding coal production in the state, persisted in its efforts to organize West Virginia. The work had to be conducted in secret, for Union organizers were followed and assaulted by guards and detectives. Miners seen talking to organizers were immediately discharged, and those who even discussed unionism were dismissed and blacklisted. A letter sent to general managers or superintendents by the notorious Baldwin Felts Agency of Bluefield, W.T., St. Virginia, which supplied guards, actually thugs, in the coal district, read, "I give you below the names of miners discharged from the Crane Creek Coal Company a few days ago for talking unionism." One UMW organizer called the New River section the most dangerous locality for an organizer of any place in the United States. John W. White, UMW president, declared bluntly, "Our organization has not been able to protect representatives in the Commonwealth. They have been assaulted and they cannot go into the fields and explain to the miners the purposes of our union, without being in danger of their lives. 12. Some organizers did manage to move through the state with the message that only through organization could the miners improve their conditions, raise their standard of living, and provide safeguards for their protection in the mines. Their activities brought some results, but by 1912, only 12,000 of the 76,000 miners in West Virginia belonged to the UMW, and of these, only 2,494 were paid-up members. Cabin Creek in Kanawha County was the only organized coal field in the state. 13. On April 1, 1912, the contract in the organized Cabin Creek district expired. As the expiration date approached, the miners presented new contract terms which included wage scales based on the rates in adjacent coal fields or increases of 2 feet each cents per ton, a working day of 9 hours instead of 10, payment of wages fortnightly in cash, improved sanitary conditions in the company houses, the employment of checkweighmen to represent the miners and to be paid by them, the right of miners to trade wherever they pleased without discrimination for not trading at the company store, a more complete recognition of the union, including the check-off system, and abolition of the mine guard system. 14. The operators, fearing that granting the new demands would enable the union to strengthen its position throughout the state, refused to negotiate and withdrew recognition of the union. The Cabin Creek miners' answer came swiftly. On April 20, they walked off the job and closed down the mines. T.S. Since the strikers who lived in company-owned houses were described by the operators as having no more rights than a domestic servant who occupies a room in the household of the employer, 16 the mine guards proceeded to forcibly evict the miners and their families. Strikebreakers were imported, the company guard was increased, Baldwin Felts detectives and guards were brought in, searchlights were mounted over the collieries, and machine guns were installed. 17 The UMW set up a tent colony for the evicted families at Holly Grove, about 15 miles from Charleston, near the mouth of Paint Creek. By July, the strike had spread to both the Cabin Creek and Paint Creek districts as non-union miners voluntarily joined the walkout, bringing the total number of strikers to 4,000 and the number of companies affected to 40. The Cabin Creek-Paint Creek strike of 1912-1913 became one of the most violent labor battles in American history. The miners and their families were threatened, beaten, and murdered, and in self-defense, the miners armed themselves with guns, erected forts, and organized armed squads to protect their families and fight back. 19 Throughout July, the miners and the Baldwin Felts guards engaged in pitched battles. On July 26, in a battle at Mucklow, not far from Holly Grove, 12 men, mostly guards, were killed. Governor William E. Glasscock dispatched 3 companies of the National Guard to the district, and on August 16, he declared a state of martial law in the area. 10 days later, the governor appointed a commission headed by the Most Reverend P. J. Donahue, the Catholic Bishop of Wheeling, to study the dispute and make an impartial report to the state legislature. 20 On August 1, the 80-year-old Mother Jones, always playing a leading role wherever coal miners were engaged in battle, addressed a meeting of 6,000 people in Charleston held to urge Governor Glasscock to remove the mine guards. She stood on the steps of the Capitol in her prim, black dress, embroidered with white lace, and with wisps of silvery hair curling around her forehead, and told the miners in a loud voice, "Let me say to you, my friends, let me say to the governor, let me say to the sheriffs and judges in the state of West Virginia, this fight will not stop until the last guard is disarmed. I don't care how much martial law the governor of West Virginia proclaims. I have had martial law proclaimed in other states where I have worked more than once and I did not stop fighting. When they took the martial law off, I began at once and he had to bring the troops back. Can't you see how to do business? If they proclaim martial law, bury your guns." 21. Protests against the presence of special guards in the Kanawha Valley began to mount. On August 8, 3,000 persons petitioned Governor Glasscock to drive out the guards. On August 21, Mother Jones presented the governor with a petition from the strikers which asserted that the armed guards had acted brutally toward miners and their families, had seized and searched citizens without warrant of law, and had denied the right of peaceable assembly and freedom of speech. The governor was urged to disarm the guards and to protect the miners' constitutional rights. After touring the area on August 30, the governor stated that the conduct of the mine guards was creating a real disturbance. 22 However, he still refused to remove them and, as might have been expected, the violence increased. On September 2, Governor Glasscock again declared martial law in the mining districts along Paint Creek and Cabin Creek and again ordered out the militia. Military courts were instituted and national guard officers began to try prisoners. Colonel George C. Wallace, the officer in charge of the Cabin Creek area, justified the action of the military commission in arresting and sentencing strikers to jail, on the theory that a state of war existed, and we were exercising our war powers. 23. On September 14, Governor Glasscock proposed that the questions at issue be arbitrated, that the miners return to work pending arbitration, and that the mine guard system be abandoned, but that the operators be allowed to employ bona fide citizens of the county as guards. The UMW, financially strained by the strike, accepted the proposal, but the operators refused, declaring that they would never recognize the union even if this were recommended by the arbitrators. 24 All this time, the military courts were busy. 37 strikers were tried and 32 of them were sentenced to 60 days each in jail for intimidating workmen who were employed in the struck mines. The governor approved the sentences. Shortly thereafter, the state courts upheld the right of the military to arrest and imprison violators of military rule. 25 While strikers were being sent to prison for violating military orders, the mine operators continued to evict the miners. 26. In the middle of October, martial law was ended and nearly all the militiamen were withdrawn from the strike district. Immediately, the operators brought back the mine guards and stepped up the importation of strikebreakers. Immediately, too, clashes between strikers and the mine guards and strikebreakers again flared up. Armed strikers seized trains carrying strikebreakers to the mines and ordered the coaches conveying the scabs to be uncoupled before they would allow the trains to proceed. Gunfire was exchanged between strikers and guards protecting the trains carrying strikebreakers. Again the governor declared martial law, ordered 4 companies back to the strike region, and appointed another military commission. Soon strikers were being arrested by the militia and tried before the military commission, which imposed sentences in some cases as long as 5 years in the penitentiary. 27. On November 2, 7, the strike commission appointed by Governor Glasscock submitted its report, together with a transcript of several hundred pages of testimony heard during its sessions. The commission condemned the mine guard system as vicious, strife-prompting and un-American. There emerges clearly that these guards recklessly and flagrantly violated, in respect to the miners on Paint Creek, respectively, the rights guaranteed by natural justice and the Constitution to every citizen, however lowly his condition and state. We are, therefore, unanimously of the opinion that the mine guard system as at present constituted should be abolished forthwith. Still, the commission concluded that the miners' living conditions were good compared with those in other coal fields, and that wages were not lower than those in other fields. However, it admitted that the miners were being overcharged at the company stores, and that some injustice had been done them by the system of docking their pay for work considered unsatisfactory. Blacklisting, which it conceded was widespread, was condemned as repugnant to the genius of our institutions. The commission upheld the right of the miners to organize but asserted that the operators do not resist this right as a general proposition, but their claim is that the peculiarly independent condition in West Virginia would render it ruinous and therefore impossible for them to recognize. The Union. 28 In making this judgment, the commission overlooked the fact that during its own hearings, Attorney Harold Houston, representing the miners, has asked, is it part of the policy of the coal operators to prevent unionism of Cabin Creek? This question produced the following reply from W. T. Knight, Chief Counsel for the Kanawha Coal Operators Association. Yes, the operators are opposed to organizations like the United Mine Workers of America. 29. In its recommendations, the Commission urged the enactment of legislation similar to the Canadian Disputes Act, a Workmen's Compensation Act, and a reduction in company store prices. 30. However, little came of its report, since the right to belong to a union and have it recognized remained a matter of heated contention. In mid-December, all 4 companies of militia were withdrawn from the strike zone and civil law was restored. On December 23, Governor Glasscock granted Christmas pardons to 7 of the 20 miners sentenced by the military commissions to imprisonment for from 1 to 5 years. The strike continued during the severe winter season. The union had removed 900 strikers, families from the strike area, but 600 still remained in the tent colonies. 31. On the night of February 7, 1913, an armored train equipped with iron plate siding and machine guns, the Bull Moose Special, crept slowly toward the tent colony at Holly Grove and stopped outside the first line of tents. Volley after volley of shots poured into the ragged tents of the sleeping miners. Miraculously, there were only a few casualties. One miner was shot dead running away from his dwelling and the wife of another was wounded in her bed. Quinn Martin, general manager of the Imperial Coal Company, not only boasted openly of the shocking attack on the tent colony, but was reported as saying, "We will go back and give them another round." 32. The fury of the strikers was expressed in a poem written by a Paint Creek miner, which went in part, "They riddled us with volley after volley. We heard their speeding bullets zip and ring. But soon we'll make them suffer for their folly. 0, buddy, how I'm longing for the spring." 33. 3 days later, the infuriated miners marched in protest to Ralph Chaplin, the IWW poet who was aiding the strikers, was the author of the poem. The miners waited for the spring when the leaves would come out and the leafless hills would no longer make them targets for enemy fire and expose them when they fired back. Ralph Chaplin, Wobbly, Chicago, 1948, pp. 125-27. Chaplin also wrote the famous "Solidarity Forever" during the strike. Mucklow. They were met by a posse of armed guards and a battle began, and before it was over, 12 miners and 4 guards were dead. Governor Glasscock declared martial law for the 3rd time, ordered 6 companies of militia to go to the strike-bound counties, and re-established the military commission. 34. A wave of arrests of strikers and their leaders now followed. Nearly 300 were arrested and tried by the military commission. On February 12, Mother Jones went to Charleston to consult the governor, but upon her arrival in the state capital, she was immediately arrested. On the same day, Charles R. Boswell, socialist editor of the Labor Argus, was arrested and charged with murder in conspiring against non-union miners and others. 35. About 125 of those arrested, including Mother Jones, were taken to Pratt and held for trial by the military court. UMW President John P. White complained, "Martial law is used to deprive our representatives of all access to the civil courts, as under martial law no decision is rendered as to the guilt or innocence of these parties, and they are simply detained to keep them out of active work for the organization and to blacken the reputation of the individuals in the organization. It is noticeable that no coal operators or their representatives are subject to the proceedings of this court." 36. The union leader's complaint was fully justified. All of the prisoners were civilians and the charges against them were for civilian offenses within the jurisdiction of the civil courts, which were open and functioning in the districts under martial law. The prisoners had been arrested on orders issued by military men, and not by civil warrants. They were to be tried without juries before courts martial. In many instances, persons had been arrested outside the martial law zone, some even for offenses committed outside the zone. 37 as Robert S. Rankin notes in his study, "When law fails, in the history of the United States, martial law has never been used on so broad a scale, in so drastic a manner, nor upon such sweeping principles as in West Virginia in 1912-13. 38. The famous IWW poet, Ralph Chaplin, writing as a Paint Creek miner, penned these lines about Mother Jones during her incarceration in Pratt. How they fear her, how they hate her kind and time-worn face. How they rush armed mobs to meet her when she moves from place to place. Bristling bayonets and sabers working shameless, deep disgrace. 39. Even while in military prison, Mother Jones was not inactive. She managed to smuggle out a letter, hastily scribbled, to William B. Wilson, a UMW leader who had been a member of Congress and who was shortly to become Secretary of Labor in President Wilson's cabinet. After describing how she had been picked up on the streets of Charleston, thrown into an auto and brought 22 miles to the military prison, she urged Wilson to get her note to Senator William E. Borah, so that he could know the facts about what was happening in West Virginia. When I get out I will give them H, she concluded. 40. A few days later, after Senator Borah had introduced a resolution in the Senate demanding an investigation of the strike by the federal government, Mother Jones wrote to him and thanked him, in behalf of the crushed and persecuted slaves of the coal mines of West Virginia. I am in confinement now for a week at the age of 80 years. I am a military prisoner. This is just what the old monarchy did to my grandparents 90 years ago in Elverland. 41. Borah's resolution failed of consideration, just as had a resolution introduced in Congress on August 19, 1912 by William B. Wilson, then a member of the House of Representatives, asking for a congressional investigation of the West Virginia strike situation. 42. Early in March, attorneys for the Union applied to the Circuit Court for a writ of habeas corpus to achieve the release of the military prisoners. The petition was granted, and the Circuit Court ordered the military authorities to justify their actions. Sheriff Hull went to Pratt to serve the court's order on the members of the military commission and the judge advocate, but, as he stepped from the train, the provost marshal informed him that he would not be permitted to serve any papers in the military district. On March 12, the Circuit Court reversed itself and upheld the right of the military commission to try cases. 43. A number of the prisoners, including Mother Jones, refused to acknowledge the right of the military courts to try them and declined even to put up a defense. John Brown, a socialist miner and one of the prisoners, explained the reason for this stand in a moving letter to his wife on March 9, 1913, written at the military camp in Pratt. As you have undoubtedly seen by the papers, Boswell, Batley, Parsons, Mother Jones, Paulson, and myself have refused to acknowledge the jurisdiction of the military court, and therefore are not putting up any defense. You, perhaps with others, do not see at this time the wisdom in such. One of the militiamen who guarded Mother Jones was friendly to the strikers, and he arranged to have her slip her letters through a hole in the floor. Tactics, seeing that we are wholly at the mercy of this tribunal, but time will tell and justify the position we take. If it was only myself personally that was concerned, I would, for the sake of gaining my liberty and being free to go to you and the children, go before this court and defend myself. Nor have I the least doubt in my mind that I would come clear. But, my dear, there are principles involved in this case infinitely deeper than the fate of any one citizen. If the capitalist class gets away with this, then constitutional government is dead, and justice for the working class is a thing of the past. If we let them get away with it, then in the future wherever and whenever the interests of the working class and the capitalist class reaches an acute stage, out will come the militia, the courts will be set aside, and the leaders railroaded to the military bullpens, and thence to the penitentiaries. Here lies the great danger. 44. The military commission went ahead with the trials and found Mother Jones and 60 others guilty of murder, conspiracy, and inciting to riot, and transmitted its findings to Governor Henry D. Hatfield, who had succeeded Governor Glasscock. In late March, the new governor released about 45 of the 65 persons who had been convicted by the military commission, conditioned on their good behavior. But, Mother, Jones was not released. I know, she wrote to a friend on April 5 from the military Bastille, they would let me go if I would go out of the state, but I will die before I give them that satisfaction. 45 among the prisoners released by Governor Hatfield were several UMW organizers who left the district immediately after a private interview with the governor. 46. In May 1913, a resolution was introduced in the Senate by Senator John W. Kern of Indiana calling for a congressional investigation of the strike. The UMW had sought such an investigation by the newly formed Department of Labor, but Secretary William B. Wilson contended that since no appropriation had been made for the department, it could not conduct an investigation. 47. The night before the question came up in the Senate, Senator Kern received a telegram from Mother Jones, which had also been smuggled out of military prison. The next day, Senator Kern read the following before an astonished Senate and press. From out of the military prison wall of Pratt, West Virginia, where I have walked over my 84th milestone in history, I send you the groans and tears and heartaches of men, women and children as I have heard them in this state. From out these prison walls, I plead with you for the honor of the nation, to push that investigation, and the children yet unborn will rise and call you blessed. 48. The investigation was voted, and on June 11, the Senate subcommittee began its hearings in Charleston. In its report, the Senate group denounced the military rule and the imprisonment of minors as a denial of constitutional rights. But it also charged that the Union's campaign was motivated by a desire to organize the West Virginia coal fields in order to render them less competitive with the organized areas. 49. Even before the Senate hearings opened, however, the strike was in the process of being settled. Having failed to break the strike for over a year and being unable to operate the mines with imported strikebreakers because of the miners' resistance, the operators were ready for a compromise. On March 26, UMW President White offered a basis for such a settlement, which Governor Hatfield watered down and then offered to the operators in the middle of April. The proposed contract's terms were a 9-hour workday, the right to select a checkweightman, semi-monthly pay, and no discrimination against union miners. 50. The operators and UMW officials accepted the compromise settlement, but the union leaders, as David A. Corbin points out, apparently feared opposition from rank-and-file miners, for, instead of submitting the proposed contract to a referendum, as was usual in contracts involving wage disputes, they called a convention of selected miners' delegates to vote on the settlement terms. 51. Even then, considerable resentment was expressed because the governor's proposals did not include the miners' most important demands: elimination of the hated guard system, payment of the Kanawha scale of wages, the check-off, and reinstatement of all strikers. Socialist delegates led the opposition to the proposed settlement, but after 3 days of debate, the delegates ratified the contract. 52. Throughout the strike, West Virginia socialists had felt that the UMW leadership was not doing enough to achieve victory, and now the socialist press charged that the settlement was forced upon the strikers by the UMW national officers, whom they accused of collaborating with the state's coal operators and Governor Hatfield to end the strike just when the miners were in a position to win their original demands. 53. As opposition to the proposed settlement mounted among the miners, most of whom agreed with the socialists' criticism, Governor Hatfield began to fear that the new contract would be rejected by the men. He immediately issued an ultimatum ordering the strikers to return to work within 36 hours or be deported from the state. He then moved to stifle socialist opposition to the settlement. The editor of the Labor Argus, a socialist weekly published in Charleston, was jailed because he editorialized against the governor's proposals. The Huntington Socialist and Labor Star was visited by a mob of militiamen and deputies after it voiced opposition to the settlement. Its offices and plant were wrecked, its type scattered over a wide area, and its staff arrested. Fred Merrick, editor of the left-wing socialist paper, Justice, was arrested and jailed because he, too, criticized the governor's proposals. In this repressive atmosphere, it was not really possible to voice further opposition to the settlement. 54. Although the strike was officially ended, many of the miners most active in the struggle were not rehired. Martial law still prevailed, and strikers and activists, especially socialist miners and socialist editors, were still in jail. In May 1913, the National Committee of the Socialist Party protested to President Wilson that a reign of terror, of officially protected lawlessness and monarchy, existed in the mining fields of West Virginia. It selected Eugene V. Debs, Victor Berger, and Adolf Germer, a young Illinois miner and UMW official, to go to America's Little Russia to investigate conditions there. Debs and Germer departed immediately for West Virginia, arriving on May 17, but Berger was delayed until the 20th. After making a whirlwind tour of the area, interviewing miners, and observing conditions firsthand, the committee met on May 22 with Governor Hatfield. After the meeting, Berger reported, "The governor saw things differently and immediately took a strong hand in the matter. The jails and bullpens were thrown open and the prisoners have been freed." All this happened after an hour and a half of conference. The governor promised that he would protect both the organizers of the miners and of the Socialist Party. He promised to repeal the martial law immediately and see to it that all the strikers got their jobs back. 55. In its report, submitted to the National Committee of the Socialist Party on May 26, 1913, the committee exonerated Hatfield from much of the criticism directed at him in the socialist press, blaming his predecessor, and reported that a better understanding between the United Mine Workers and the Socialist Party would pave the way for a concerted political and economic organization of the entire state. 56. Editors of the socialist press in West Virginia bitterly condemned the David A. Corbin argues persuasively that the members of the investigating committee were eager to achieve full, cordial relations between the socialists and the UMW leadership and thus would do nothing to upset the settlement worked out between the mine union leaders and Governor Hatfield. Betrayal in the West Virginia coal fields, Eugene V. Debs and the Socialist Party of America, 1912-1941, Journal of American History, Vol. LXIV, March, 1978, pp. 997-98. Committee's report for having whitewashed Governor Hatfield, and the industrial worker sharply attacked Debs for having knifed the struggling and outraged miners in the back. Samuel Gompers, too, denounced the clean bill of health given to the governor. 57 in reply. Debs cited the fact that shortly after the committee had arrived in West Virginia, 60 socialist miners were released from military prison, martial law was revoked, the suppressed socialist papers were permitted to resume publication, and assurance was received from Governor Hatfield that free speech, free assemblage and the right to organize should prevail. When this was proved to be more fancy than fact, Debs charged his critics, especially the West Virginia socialists, with seeking to undermine the United Mine Workers in order to open the door for the IWW to move into West Virginia and take over the organization of the miners. Scholars who have studied the controversy, however, have rejected Debs' charges. S.B. In the end, the rank-and-file miners did win a better contract. Refusing to accept the Hatfield Compromise settlement, the miners in Paint Creek and Cabin Creek renewed their strike. Secretary of Labor William B. Wilson then appointed a commission of mediation and conciliation, which began negotiations on June 5 with UMW national officers, who had been forced to comply with the rank-and-file rejection of the settlement, and the operators. Unable to count any longer on the governor to issue another proclamation of martial law or to otherwise intimidate the miners, the operators were compelled to make new concessions. On June 18, Secretary Wilson wired John P. White, "Settlement of West Virginia strike arrived at today, subject to ratification by West Virginia miners." The new settlement included several of the miners' original demands, such as the check-off and a wage increase. The miners went back to work on July 1, and on July 15, in convention, they ratified the new agreement by a vote of 2 to 1.59. Unfortunately, the mines in West Virginia still remained largely unorganized. In 1912, at the beginning of the strike, the UMW's strength represented 3% of the miners of West Virginia. In 1915, the figure stood at only 5%. Chapter 9. Revolt of the Miners. Colorado, 1913–1914. On April 21, 1914, in the quiet of the afternoon, a telephone lineman was making his way through the ruins of a tent colony in southern Colorado. He lifted an iron cot covering a pit under one of the tents and found the blackened, swollen bodies of 11 children and 2 women. The news was flashed to the world, and the tragedy was given a name: the Ludlow Massacre. All told, 21 persons, including the 11 children, lost their lives in one of the most shameful episodes in all of American history. The tragedy was the central event in a 14-month strike of members of the United Mine Workers of America against the management of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, which took a toll of 66 lives. It was a battle against conditions which today seem to belong to the Middle Ages, but which were typical of many industrial communities in America on the eve of World War I. But in none did the conditions more resemble those of medieval feudalism than in the Rockefeller-dominated coalfields of southern Colorado. In 1902, John D. Rockefeller Sr. bought control of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company and the Victor Fuel Company, the 2 major producers in the southern fields, and made them part of Rockefeller's industrial empire. Colorado Fuel and Oil produced 40% of the coal dug in Colorado and dominated coal and iron production activities in the Southwest. In 1911, Rockefeller Sr. turned over his interest in the corporation, which amounted to 40% of the stock, to his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who made major policy decisions from his office at 26 Broadway in New York City. John R. Lawson, the most important leader of the 1913–1914 strike, in testimony before the Commission on Industrial Relations, characterized the absentee owner, Rockefeller, as invested with what is virtually the power of life and death over 12,000 men and their families, for the isolated nature of the coal industry lends itself to absolutism unknown in other activities. 2. The situation was made even worse by the fact that both J. F. Wellborn, president of Colorado Fuel and Iron, and L. M. Bowers, its superintendent, maintained their offices in Denver, 200 miles from the mines. Responsibility for the mining area fell to E. H. Weitzel, whose office was in Pueblo, 50 miles north of the area. Colorado Fuel and Iron owned 27 mining camps, including all of the land in these camps, the houses, the saloons, the schools, the churches and other buildings located within the camp environs, and the huts in which the miners lived and for which they paid exorbitant rents. A miner could be summarily evicted, since he had signed a lease agreeing that it could be terminated on 3 days' notice, and that he and his family could be immediately dispossessed. As a result, if a miner aroused the company's anger, this could bring about not only the loss of his job, but eviction from his home as well. No words can adequately describe the contrast between the wild beauty of the Colorado countryside and the unspeakable squalor of these mining camps. The miners' huts, which were usually shared by several families, were made up of clapboard walls and thin planked floors, with leaking roofs, sagging doors, broken windows, and old newspapers nailed to the walls to keep out the cold. Some families, particularly the black families, were forced to live in tiny cubicles not much larger than chicken coops. 3. Within sight of the huts were the coke ovens, the mine tipple, and the breaker house, with thick clouds of soot clogging the air and settling on the ground, effectively strangling any shoots of grass or flowers that tried to keep alive. Wriggling along the canyon walls, behind the huts, was a sluggish creek, dirty yellow and laden with the slag of the mine and the refuse of the camps. Alongside the creek the children played, barefoot, ragged, and often hungry. The miners received their wages, such as they were, in company scrip, which was discounted when converted into cash. They traded in company stores, where they paid excessively high prices. They received treatment from a company doctor, whose fees were deducted from their wages whether they were sick or well. They worked in mines which were notorious for their lack of safety precautions and in a state which had a grim record of fatal accidents. In 1912, the year preceding the strike, the rate of fatal accidents for the entire nation was 3.15 for each million tons of coal mined, while in Colorado, the rate was 11.86. The high accident rate in the Colorado mines was aggravated by the absence of any workmen's compensation law in the state. The surviving widow and children of a mine accident victim were left to wage a relentless struggle against poverty. 4. Each mining camp was a feudal domain, with the company acting as lord and master. It had a marshal, a law enforcement officer paid by the company. Teachers were chosen and paid by the company. Company officials were appointed as election judges. Company-dominated coroners and judges prevented injured employees from collecting damages. The law consisted of the company rules. Curfews were imposed. Company guards, brutal thugs armed with machine guns and rifles loaded with explosive bullets, would not admit any suspicious stranger into the camp and would not permit any miner to leave. It is not difficult to imagine the condition of the miners, the serfs, in such a community. Most of them were immigrants representing 21 nationality groups: Greeks, Italians, Croatians, Russians, Serbs, Montenegrins, Bulgarians, Poles, etc., all equally held in contempt by the operators and their agents. 5. On paper, Colorado had an excellent code of laws for the protection of workers. But in reality, the will of the operator was the law. The operators prohibited the miners from appointing their own coal checkweighman, with the result that they were robbed of from 400 to 800 pounds in each ton. They paid their workers in company-printed scrip instead of legal currency, so that the average daily wage of $1.60 had a purchasing power of about $1. They worked the miners for more than 8 hours a day. They prohibited them from patronizing stores of their own choice and compelled them to buy at company stores, where prices were often twice as high as elsewhere, and they forced the miners to vote as the foreman directed, all in open defiance of the law. The truth is that neither state, county, nor federal law counted for much in the feudal domain dominated by the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. Reverend Atkinson of Colorado reported the following exchange in an interview with Colorado Governor Elias Ammons. Rev. Atkinson, have you no constitutional law and government in Colorado? Gov. Ammons, not a bit in those counties where the coal mines are located. Rev. Atkinson, do you mean to say that in large sections of your state there is no constitutional liberty? Gov. Ammons, absolutely none. 6. In 1914, a report of the Commission on Industrial Relations stated, not only the government in these counties, Huerfano and Las Animas, coal counties, but of the state has been brought under their domination and forced to do the company's bidding, and the same companies have even flaunted the will of the nation as expressed by the President of the United States. Little wonder, then, that one student of the 1913-1914 Colorado strike describes it, not so much as a struggle for higher wages or other tangible advantages as a revolt against a political, economic and social despotism. 7. In 1901, Colorado was organized into a district of the United Mine Workers of America. During the next 2 years, the Union grew, as thousands of miners, unable to endure the deplorable conditions in the coal camps, looked to unionism as a solution. In September 1903, local delegates voted to strike unless their demands were granted. These included an 8-hour day, semi-monthly pay, the abolition of payment in company scrip, a 2,000-pound ton instead of one of 2,400, and better ventilation in the mines. Only the demand for an 8-hour day was not required by statutes. In fact, in the main, the miners were merely calling for the enforcement of the state laws. When the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company and the Victor Fuel Company refused to negotiate, the miners struck on November 9. Immediately, strikers' families were evicted from the company houses. Union organizers were arrested, and strikebreakers were rushed in, protected by company guards and state troops. After the company guards had killed and wounded several strikers, many of the strikers acquired weapons in order to defend themselves. Finally, military rule was established, financed by the coal companies, railroads, merchants, and property owners. Military arrests followed, and between 400 and 500 striking miners were rounded up by the state soldiers and armed guards and loaded into 2 trains. One was dispatched to Kansas and the other to New Mexico. The men were unloaded in the prairies and warned to keep away from Colorado. This massive state intervention on the side of the coal companies broke the strike, and in October 1904, it was called off. 8. Nothing was gained by the strike, but it did serve to intensify the anger and resentment among the miners and set the stage for an even bitterer struggle between the union and the coal companies for between 1904 and 1913, not a single change took place to improve the conditions of the miners. Indeed, many of the strikers of 1913 had been brought into the area as strikebreakers in 1903. Yet so grim were both their working and living conditions that they, in turn, became the strikers a decade later. After secretly organizing a recruiting campaign for 2 years, the United Mine Workers sent Vice President Frank J. Hayes, John McLennan, President of District No. 15, which included Colorado, E. L. Doyle, Secretary of District No. 15, and John Lawson, Executive Board Member, to Colorado. A policy-making committee was established, and in an effort to stave off a strike, attempts were made to get Governor Ammons to arrange a conference with the mine operators. These failed, as did an attempt by the Department of Labor to mediate the dispute. Early in September 1913, acting on a request from the UMW for assistance in mediating the dispute, Secretary of Labor William B. Wilson appointed Ethelbert Stewart as mediator. Before going to Colorado, Stewart first went to New York City to enlist the aid of John D. Rockefeller Jr., but he could not even get in to see him. Instead, he was told by a member of Rockefeller's staff that any decision with regard to the policy of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company would be made in Colorado and that the New York office would not interfere. 9. On September 15, 1913, at Trinidad, Colorado, 250 delegates from the state's mining camps opened their convention, singing, "We will win the fight today, boys. We'll win the fight today." Shouting the battle cry of Union. "We will rally from the coal mines." Shouting the battle cry of Union. Chorus. "The Union forever, hurrah boys, hurrah. Down with the Baldwins, asterisk up with the law. For we're coming, Colorado, we're coming all the way." Shouting the battle cry of Union. Fed up with Colorado Fuel and Iron's refusal even to meet with union representatives, the miners demanded action. They were supported by the veteran labor organizer, 83-year-old Mother Jones, just released from jail for having helped the West Virginia coal miners in their fight against company feudalism. In an hour-long speech, she stirred the miners' spirit of revolt. The reference is to the strike-breaking Baldwin Felts Guards. Rise up and strike. If you are too cowardly to fight, there are enough women in this country to come in and beat it out of you. If it is slavery or strike, why I say strike, until the last one of you drop into your graves. Strike and stay with it as we did in West Virginia. We are going to stay here in southern Colorado until the banner of industrial freedom floats over every coal mine. We are going to stand together and never surrender. When one get Colorado and Alabama organized, one will ask God to take me to my rest. 1 a.m. going to force the operators to concede that human life is to be regarded above property life. The convention voted unanimously to strike on September 23 for union recognition, a 10% increase in wage scales, the 8-hour day, pay for dead work, timbering, removing fall, handling impurities, etc. checkweighmen in all mines to be elected by the miners. Free choice of stores, boarding houses, and doctors, enforcement of the Colorado mining laws, and abolition of the notorious guard system which has prevailed in the mining camps of Colorado for many years. As in the case of the 1903 strike, nearly all of the demands were already on the statute books of Colorado but had been ignored by the company. I.O. Having learned through an effective spy system that the union's financial position was precarious and the UMW leaders did not really intend to go through with the strike, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company did not take the strike vote seriously. On September 19, Superintendent Bowers informed the New York office that all the union officials really wanted was to obtain an interview with the operators in order to be able to boast before the public that they have secured the principal point, namely, recognition of the union. Confident that the union was in no position to conduct an effective strike, the operators refused all further offers of mediation by the Department of Labor. E.M. Bowers informed Ethelbert Stewart, who had gone to Colorado in an effort to stave off a strike, that the company would never recognize the union. In a letter to Rockefeller, Bowers assured the absentee owner that the officials of the company would stand by this declaration until our bones were bleached white as chalk in these Rocky Mountains. Rockefeller expressed complete approval of this course. 11. While scoffing at the strike vote, the operators still took no chances. Even before the miners walked out, they ordered them out of the company houses into a bitter mountain winter. The UMW leased land just outside the company property, brought in tents from West Virginia, and set up tent colonies in Ludlow, Suffield, Forbes, Berwind, Starkville, Lavetta, and 7 other sites. On September 23, a scene of epic proportions was enacted in the coal mine district of southern Colorado. Between 11 and 13,000 miners, about 90% of the workers in the mines, gathered up their belongings and moved with their families to the hastily improvised tent colonies. 12. The miners' wives and children tried to keep warm that winter, in temperatures as low as 40 to 50 degrees below zero, by shoveling out from under 4 to 6 foot snowfalls, while their men fought a bloody war against strikebreakers, company guards, and Baldwin Felts detectives sworn in as deputy sheriffs. The Baldwin Felts agency brought in a special automobile, with a Gatling gun mounted on top, which became known as the Death Special. Its side-armored, it roamed the countryside with several rifle-carrying detectives in the front seat, attacking the tent colonies indiscriminately. Day after day, mine guards, wearing deputy badges, fired at the strikers. On October 5, the operators shipped 4 machine guns into the strike zone. The miners threw up breastworks and dug pits under the tents to protect the women and children. The machine guns were not just for show. A machine gun fired into women and children being evacuated from the Forbes tent camp. One miner was killed, a small boy was hit 9 times but survived, and a young girl was shot in the face. On October 24, 1913, mine guards, wearing deputy sheriff badges as usual, fired into a group of strikers in Walsenburg and killed 4 of them. 13. As the violence intensified, Governor Ammons ordered the National Guard into the strike zone. The militia arrived in Ludlow on October 31, 1913 and received a warm welcome from the miners. Even state. Adjutant General Chase, a longtime hater of trade unions, remarked on the friendliness of the strikers toward the militiamen. He wrote in his report, "The parade of the troops of the Ludlow tent colony was memorable. The road for a half-mile or more between the point of detraining and the entrance to the colony was lined on either side by men, women, and children. Many of the men were in the strange costume of the Greek, Montenegrin, Serbian, and Bulgarian armies, for the colony numbered among its inhabitants many returned veterans of the Balkan Wars. The little children were dressed in white, as for a Sunday school picnic. All carried small American flags and sang continually the Union songs. Through this line of men, women, and children the troops paraded infantry, cavalry, and field artillery. Flags were waved in welcome, and an improvised band of the strikers heralded our approach. 14. Within a few weeks, however, the feeling toward the troops changed. From friendliness to deep hostility. The 1,000 or so soldiers under Chase's command were literally strike-breaking agents of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. The company paid their salaries and the soldiers were quartered in company buildings and furnished with supplies by the company. Soon, the militia began recruiting mine guards to replace men released on the basis of hardship and business needs. The mine guards were in the favored position of receiving $3 a day from the operators in addition to their $1 as militiamen, both salaries paid by Colorado Fuel and Iron, is. On November 28, Governor Ammons, yielding to pressure, lifted the ban on the importation of strikebreakers from outside the state and ordered the militia to become the protective agent for the escort of the scabs into the mines. The source of the pressure for this step was spelled out by Superintendent Bowers in a letter to Rockefeller. Besides the bankers, the Chamber of Commerce, the Real Estate Exchange, together with a great many of the best businessmen, have been urging the governor to take steps to drive these vicious agitators out of the state. Another mighty power has been rounded up in behalf of the operators by the gathering together of 14 of the editors of the most important newspapers in Denver, Pueblo, Trinidad, Walsenburg, Colorado Springs, and other of the larger places of the state. 16. In searching the miners' tents for guns, the militiamen robbed them and even raped some of the women. Strikers were thrown into jail without the slightest provocation and were held without any opportunity to prove their innocence. Mother Jones was arrested and held incommunicado for 20 days, with 2 armed sentries posted outside her prison door. On January 22, 1914, there was a parade of women in Trinidad to protest the imprisonment of Mother Jones. At its head, an Italian woman carried the American flag. A troop of cavalry, led personally by General Chase, the commanding general of the militia, intercepted the marchers. When the parade reformed and started back to its initial point, a troop of cavalry, supported by foot soldiers, broke into the ranks of the women. A number of them were injured and 18 were jailed. Not too long thereafter, militia cavalrymen destroyed the tent colony near Forbes and drove the inhabitants, including women and children, into a mountain snowstorm. 17. After a careful investigation, a committee of 4 Union men and Professor James H. Brewster of the University of Colorado found that the militia had tried to persuade strikers to go back into the mines, had escorted strikebreakers into the area, had frequently held strikers for long periods without filing any charges, had assaulted young girls, and had participated in robberies and holdups. After investigating the strike situation during February and March 1914, the Congressional Subcommittee Ones and Mining concluded that the National Guard had been guilty of many of the same offenses. Finally, George P. West, who investigated the strike for the U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations, noted that the Colorado National Guard no longer offered even a pretense of fairness or partiality, and its units in the field had degenerated into a force of professional gunmen and adventurers who were economically dependent on and subservient to the will of the coal operators. 18. Although criticism of the militiaman's conduct did not seem to affect Governor Ammons, the state's precarious financial position resulting from the mounting costs in helping the operators break the strike did. Early in April 1914, the governor withdrew the bulk of the National Guard from the strike zone. Only 35 men in Company B, formerly mine guards, were left. On April 18, 100 deputies in the pay of Colorado Fuel and Iron were formed into Troop A of the National Guard and were sent to join Company B. The designated spot was a rocky ridge overlooking the 1,000 men, women, and children who lived in the tent colony at Ludlow, the largest colony of strikers. The Ludlow colony was under the supervision of Louis Tikas, a Greek strike leader, who was loved and admired by men, women, and children alike at the colony because of his deep concern for their welfare and his keen understanding of the problems of the strike. A graduate of the University of Athens, Tikas wielded considerable influence over the immigrants in southern Colorado, and especially over the Greeks, the most militant element among the strikers in the Ludlow colony. The two officers selected to take charge of the command at the Ludlow colony were well fitted for the job assigned them by the company. One was Major Patrick Hamrock, a Denver saloonkeeper. But the dominant figure was Lieutenant Kenneth E. Linderfelt, a man especially hated by the strikers who was known to the colony's inhabitants as Jesus Christ, since he had once told a striker's wife, "I am Jesus. Christ and my men on horses are Jesus Christ's and we must be obeyed." On December 30, 1913, the powerfully built officer came upon a teenage boy, the son of a striker, on a road near the colony. He promptly knocked the youth unconscious. Linderfelt had a special hatred for Louis Tikas, to whom he referred contemptuously as Lou the Greek. One day, Linderfelt found Tikas alone, beat him brutally, and had him dragged to jail. 19. April 19, 1914 was the Greek Orthodox Easter Sunday, and a group of Ludlow strikers were picnicking in a nearby meadow. It was one of the first sunny days of spring, and they were playing baseball. Over the hill from the north came 5 gunmen on horseback, rifles slung over their shoulders. They stopped near the players and one of them shouted, "Have your fun today. We'll have our roast tomorrow." On the morning of April 20th, Linderfelt approached the camp at Ludlow and demanded that Louis Tikas release an unidentified person. After a search, Tikas met Linderfelt at the Ludlow depot and assured him that no such person could be found. Although Linderfelt later conceded that he could not remember the anonymous person's name, he and his armed guard companions bitterly denounced the Greek strike leader. Finally, Tikas retreated toward the camp. Shortly thereafter, the quiet of the morning was shaken by an explosion. Rushing from their tents, the strikers could see columns of black smoke rising slowly from Water Tank Hill, where the militia was stationed. Major Hamrock, after talking with General Chase, had ordered the explosion of 2 dynamite bombs as a signal to the troops, who were armed with Springfield rifles and at least 2 machine guns. For a little while, the countryside was unbearably still and tense. Then, exactly at 9 a.m., the dull clatter of a machine gun began and the first bullets ripped through the canvas of the tents. The clatter became a deafening roar as more machine guns went into action. Then the high-powered rifles of the militiamen joined in and poured a hail of explosive bullets into the tents. 5 strikers and a 10-year-old boy were killed by gunfire early in the battle as militia bullets ripped through the tents. 21. The men dashed from tent to draw the fire and flung themselves into deep arroyo's ugly gashes in the Ludlow Hills. Many of the women had been undressed when the firing began, but they ran crazily from tent to tent, hugging children to their breasts, seeking shelter. 50 of the women were pregnant, and one of the mothers gave birth to a baby as she fled from the colony. Some of the women managed to run off into the hills and hide in nearby ranch houses. Others crawled with their children into the dark pits and caves which had been dug under a few of the tents. It was these dugouts which saved the strikers, families from total annihilation, for the colony was mercilessly raked by rifle and machine gun fire during the day. The soldiers and mine guards, an eyewitness reported, tried to kill everybody, anything they saw move, even a dog, they shot at. 22. Had it not been for Tika's rescue efforts, the Ludlow horror might have been even worse. Throughout the day, he and Pearl Jolly, the wife of a striker, moved from tent to tent, pulling the women and children out of their cellars and ordering them to move among the arroyos to the Black Hills, some 2 miles east of the colony. As Tikas was attempting to help a woman and 2 children escape from one of the cellars, he was captured by the troops. Linderfelt, who had threatened to get the Union leader, now had his opportunity. Surrounded by his men, the burly lieutenant greeted his captive with, "Oh, it's you, you goddamn lousy redneck." Then, As Tikas replied, the lieutenant seized his army rifle by the barrel and brought the stock crashing down on the head of the defenseless prisoner with such force that the stock of the heavy gun was broken. Muttering that he had ruined a good rifle, Linderfelt turned and walked away. 3 rifle bullets tore into Tika's back, killing him. The terse report of the incident by the military board simply stated, Lt. K. E. Linderfelt swung his Springfield rifle, breaking the head of the prisoner, Tikas. 23. 2 other Union prisoners, among them James Filer, the local Union secretary, met their deaths in a similar manner. Both were shot deliberately by their captors. 24. As the sun lowered behind the Black Hills on April 20, the firing of the guns decreased. The soldiers now moved slowly alongside the tents. They drenched the canvas with coal oil. At approximately 5:30 p.m., the southwest corner of the tent colony caught fire. At the same time, reinforcements for the militia in the form of deputy sheriffs arrived from Trinidad. Thus reinforced, Lieutenant Linderfelt led a raid on the stricken camp with the soldiers yelling battle cries as they ran. The screams of terrified women and children drowned out the war cries of the troops. When they reached the colony, the militiamen became a murderous, pillaging mob. The soldiers deliberately applied torches to the tents which had not yet caught fire. They looted and smashed their way through the miners' homes, systematically destroying what they were unable to steal. On Tuesday morning, April 21, the sun shone down on a pitiful scene. The Ludlow tent colony, which had for 7 months been the homes of the striking miners and their families, was now a miserable shambles. Here and there, an iron bedstead, a stove, a child's toy, and bits of broken pottery and glass marked the former site of a tent. It was then that a telephone lineman, going through the ruins, lifted a twisted iron cot that covered one of the larger pits and discovered the bodies of 2 young mothers and 11 children, ranging in age from 3 months to 9 years. The coroner's jury which investigated the cause of the burning of the tent colony concluded that the cause of the deaths was fire started by militiamen under Major Hamrock and Lt. Linderfelt, or mine guards, or both. 25 inches. The number of fatalities at Ludlow may never be known for certain, concludes George P. McGovern in his study of the strike. But it is likely that 32 persons were either shot or burned to death. After a farcical trial, Linderfelt and others connected with the outrages were found guilty and punished by trifling changes in their eligibility for promotion. 26. The story of the Ludlow massacre was headlined in the press all over the country, although it sometimes received second place to headlines about the developing crisis with Mexico. Some papers tried to shift the blame from the company and its hired gunmen to the miners. Thus, the conservative New York Times, while referring to crazily office-red troops, and while describing the events at Ludlow as worse than the order that sent the Light Brigade into the jaws of death, worse in its effects than the Black Hole of Calcutta, nevertheless reported women and children roasted in pits of tent colony as flames destroy it. Miners' store of ammunition and dynamite exploded, scattering death and ruin. But the Denver Express put the blame where it belonged when it wrote, mothers and daughters were crucified at Ludlow on the cross of human liberty. Their crucifixion was effected by the operator's paid gunmen. These dead will go down in history as the hero victims of the burnt offering laid on the altar of the great god Greed. 27. At the conclusion of a Ludlow protest meeting in Carnegie Hall in New York City, Upton Sinclair organized a demonstration in front of the Rockefeller office at 26 Broadway. Wearing bands of black crepe to symbolize the death of the Ludlow victims, he and 4 women began to walk silently back and forth in front of the Rockefeller headquarters. When the group was arrested and jailed for this disturbance, Mrs. Sinclair and others continued the morning picket line. At the head of New York's May Day parade that year was a delegation of mourners protesting the murder of the Colorado miners. Among the banners they carried were many with slogans denouncing Rockefeller, the most striking of which read, "He uses Bibles in New York and bullets in Colorado," a bitter reference to Rockefeller's famous Sunday school sermons. 29. From the United Mine Workers, an appeal went out to all national and international labor unions in the country. Will you, for God's sake, in the name of humanity, call upon your citizenship to demand of the President of the U.S. and both houses of Congress to leave Mexico alone and come into Colorado and relieve those miners, their wives and children, who are being slaughtered by murderous mine guards. 30. And from Denver came a call to arms, addressed to the Unionists of Colorado and signed by the UMW officials and the Secretary-Treasurer of the Western Federation of Miners. It read, "Organize the men in your community in companies of volunteers to protect the workers of Colorado against the murder and cremation of men, women, and children by armed assassins in the employ of coal corporations, serving under the guise of state militiamen. The state is furnishing no protection to us and we must protect ourselves, our wives and children, from these murderous assassins. We intend to exercise our lawful right as citizens to defend our homes and our constitutional rights." 31. From coast to coast, there was a response to the appeal of the Colorado miners. Hundreds of mass meetings were held. Thousands of dollars were sent for arms and ammunition, and armed trade unionists were arriving in Colorado when federal troops, sent by President Wilson, came in. The Ludlow tragedy had turned Colorado into a battlefield. As news of it spread, strikers in all parts of southern Colorado, joined by outraged laboring men and sympathizers, poured into the strike zone and struck back furiously against the wanton killings. The enraged strikers attacked company camps and mines throughout southern Colorado and even in the vicinity of Denver. Governor Ammons tried to stem the violence by ordering an additional 600 militiamen to report to duty, but only about 25% of the men responded. At last, in desperation, the governor admitted that the situation was beyond his control and asked President Wilson for federal troops. On April 28, Wilson declared a state of national emergency in Colorado and directed that federal troops proceed immediately to the strike area. 32. The federal troops arrived in Colorado on May 2. Soon, the United States Regular Army troops were also sent later that same year to Arkansas during the strike led by District 21 of the United Mine Workers against the Mammoth Vein Coal Mining Company in Sebastian County. The strike began early in 1914 when the company refused to renew its contract with the UMW and attempted to operate with non-union labor. The troops were sent in by the Secretary of War after pitched battles between armed Union miners and company guards resulted in several workers being killed and the main mine almost totally destroyed. The federal troops were commanded by Major Nathaniel McClure, a veteran of the Colorado Coal Field Wars. The strike ended in defeat. Samuel A. Sizer, This is Union Man's Country, Sebastian County 1914, Arkansas. Historical Quarterly, Volume 27, Winter, 1968, pp. 306-29. Guards and militia were withdrawn, strikers and deputy sheriffs alike were required to surrender their arms, and strikebreakers imported in violation of state law were compelled to leave. Thus the fighting ended. 33. But the strike dragged on while the operators showed not the slightest willingness to yield. In testimony before the House Committee on Mines and Mining and before the U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. made this position crystal clear. After explaining that he had not visited Colorado for 10 years and had relied completely for information about the labor situation on the word of the officials of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, a statement which the Commission on Industrial Relations later characterized as bearing no semblance to the truth, Rockefeller gave his complete support to the company officials in Denver. He insisted, first, that the strike was simply the work of outside agitators and that the miners themselves had no legitimate grievance, and secondly, that the open shop represented a great American principle in defense of which no sacrifice was too great. When Congressman Martin Foster suggested that perhaps the killing of people and shooting of children might impel Rockefeller to inquire more carefully into the situation, the witness outlined his view of what was at stake in the Colorado struggle. We believe that the issue is not a local one in Colorado. It is a national issue whether workers shall be allowed to work under such conditions as they may choose. As part owners of the property, our interest in the laboring men in this country is so immense, so deep, so profound that we stand ready to lose every cent we have put in that company rather than see the men we have employed thrown out of work and have imposed upon them conditions which are not of their seeking and which neither they nor we can see are in our interest. Congressman Foster asked if Rockefeller preferred that the violence continue rather than make an attempt to settle the strike, to which the witness replied, in effect, that only one thing could be done to settle the strike, and that was to unionize the camps, and our interest in labor is so profound, and we believe so sincerely that interest demands that the camps shall be open camps, that we expect to stand by the officers at all costs. When asked by Congressman Foster if he would hold to that in its report, the commission noted that Rockefeller followed step by step the struggle of his executive officials to retain arbitrary power, and to prevent the installation of machinery for collective bargaining, by which abuses might automatically be corrected, and he supported and encouraged this struggle in every letter he wrote to his agents. 63rd Congress, 3rd Session, House Document 136, Washington, D.C. 1915, L.Eport on the Colorado Strike Investigation, page 34. Position: if that costs all your property and kills all your employees. Rockefeller replied, it is a great principle. 34. It was when he was questioned at the hearings of the Commission on Industrial Relations by its chairman, Frank P. Walsh, that Rockefeller's facade of upholding democratic principles in opposing unionism and of being so far removed from the events in Colorado began to crumble. Having examined the correspondence between the coal company officials and the Rockefeller office in New York, Walsh introduced concrete evidence that Rockefeller had fully supported the refusal of the company to negotiate with the union. It was clear from the correspondence that both the company in Colorado and Rockefeller insisted upon the unconditional surrender of the United Mine Workers. 35. The two government agencies that heard Rockefeller's testimony concluded that the strike could have been settled, but that Rockefeller would rather spend the money of the company for guns, pay of detectives and mine guards and starve the miners into submission. 36. And that is how the strike finally ended, with the miners starved into submission. Early in September 1914, President Wilson submitted to both sides proposals to end the strike, based on the recommendations of two presidential appointees, Howell Davies and W. R. Fairley. The settlement called for the operators and miners to pledge themselves to a 3-year truce based on 6 conditions. 1. That the mine labor laws of the state be strictly enforced. 2. The restoration of work of all striking miners who had not been found guilty of violating the law. 3. The prohibition of intimidation of either union or non-union workers. 4. The abolition of the mine guards. 5. The prohibition of picketing and parading. And 6. No suspension of work pending the investigation of any matter in dispute. Responsibility for enforcing the conditions was to be placed in the hands of 3 commissioners to be appointed by the President, and a majority decision of the Commission was to be final. 37. The miners accepted the proposal on September 16 at a convention in Trinidad, the site of the strike vote a year earlier. But the operators only accepted 3 of the proposals, rejecting 2 out of hand, 2 and 6, and accepting the remaining 1 only if modified. They insisted they could. When asked by Walsh if he should not inquire as to the responsibility of company officials for the Ludlow tragedy, Rockefeller replied, well, I think so long as I am undertaking to do the things that I think should be done, I shall have to reserve the right to do them in the ways that seem to me best. Asked by Walsh if he did not feel moral responsibility for the violence, in view of the fact that the militia in the Ludlow killings were paid from company funds, Rockefeller answered, I should have felt greater responsibility for the officers of the company if they had not used all means in their power to protect life and property. New York Times, May 21, 1915. Not restore to work all who had not been found guilty, since there were still 332 miners under indictment for murder and another 13,7 for other so-called crimes. 38. As its final effort to break the deadlock, Union officials agreed to hold a convention of the striking miners on November 19 for the purpose of calling off the strike, on condition that President Wilson would appoint a commission to arbitrate the dispute. The president quickly accepted the UMW proposal and appointed a special three-man commission of arbitration. Meanwhile, federal troops patrolled the strike area, limiting the strikers' ability to picket or otherwise carry out strike duties. On December 10, 1914, a special UMW convention in Denver called off the strike. Federal troops began to leave Colorado on January 1, 1915, and by the 10th of the month, the state was again in complete control. So, too, were the coal operators. After 15 months, the strike had been crushed by a combination of guns, bayonets, and hunger. At least 66 men, women, and children had been killed. Not one militiaman or mine guard had been indicted for murder, but John R. Lawson, the leader of the strike against Colorado Fuel and Iron, was tried and convicted of murder. The union had not won recognition. Instead, a company union, the Industrial Representation Plan, was installed in the mining camps. 39. The Industrial Representation Plan, worked out by Mackenzie King of Canada in close cooperation with Rockefeller, went into effect at the Colorado Fuel and Iron coal mines in October 1915 on the company's Pueblo steel mills during the following year. Soon known as the Rockefeller Plan, it represented the birth of company unions. It provided that the men at each mine should elect at least 2 representatives to serve for a period of 1 year. These men were to meet annually with an equal number of company officials, and at these sessions, they were given the right to discuss grievances or other matters of interest. 40. As might be expected, the United Mine Workers denounced the plan. Nor was it alone. After a careful study, U.S. Commission on Industrial Lawson was accused of murdering John Nimmo, one of the deputies paid by the companies and appointed by the sheriff. No effort was made to prove that Lawson had fired the fatal shot. Commenting on his conviction, the Commission on Industrial Relations declared, "It is anarchism for profits and revenge, and it menaces the security and integrity of American institutions as they seldom have been menaced before." Report on the Colorado Strike Investigation, p. 22. Lawson's conviction was overturned on appeal. Although technically the Colorado strike was lost by the United Mine, the mining camps, Joseph G. Rayback points out that the union itself showed a new spurt of life during the same period, as 150,000 miners joined its ranks. A History of American Labor, New York, 1963, page 258. Relations investigator George P. West agreed with the union that it was a company tool which offered the workers only the illusion of collective bargaining. The plan, he pointed out, embodied none of the principles of effectual collective bargaining and instead is a hypocritical pretense of granting what is in reality withheld. It was a plan devised, not for the benefit of the employees, he declared, but for the purpose of ameliorating or removing the unfavorable criticism of Mr. Rockefeller which had arisen throughout the country following his rejection of President Wilson's plan of settlement. 41. It soon became clear that the plan provided no relief from many of the miners' most common grievances. The battle of the miners against the Rockefeller-dominated Colorado Fuel and Iron Company continued. In 1928, another strike broke out. The United Mine Workers was back again, this time for good. Later, the United Steel Workers of America organized the steel mills of Colorado Fuel and Iron. Today, on the site of the Ludlow Massacre, there stands a monument erected by the United Mine Workers. Annually, thousands of union-conscious motorists turn off the main highway between Trinidad and Pueblo to look at this shrine. On the monument is the inscription, "In memory of the men, women, and children who lost their lives in freedom's cause at Ludlow, Colorado, April 20, 1914. Some sing one of the songs written by the striking miners shortly after the outrage, called the Ludlow Massacre, which went, "Now folks, let me tell you a story about a terrible crime that was done in Ludlow, Colorado, to men that work in the mine. Our children, they were so hungry. Our wives were thin and worn. We were striking against a rich man. Meanest ever was born. John D., he'd stacks of money. John D., he'd stacks of gold.
John D., he was warm in winter.
While mining folks went cold, he sent down his hired gunmen. They'd orders to shoot on sight.
He sent down troops with helmets to break the miners' fight. John D., he was a Christian. John D., the Psalms he sung.
But he'd no mercy in his heart. He shot down young and old.
One night when all were sleeping,
all wrapped up in their dreams,
we heard a loud explosion. We heard most terrible screams. Oh, save us from the burning flames.
We heard our children cry. But John D. laughed and shot them down. Right there before our eyes. Folks the country over, and mining camps around, their hearts got sick with pity at what happened in our town. It was a terrible thing to do. It was an awful thing. And mining men like me made up this little song to sing. To sing it to the people. Poor folks that work and sweat. What John D. did in Ludlow, they never should forget. 42.
Chapter 10. Revolt of the Michigan.
Copper miners, 1913. During the years preceding World War I, militant mine strikes were not limited to the coal fields. The workers in the copper mines, too, had to battle conditions similar to those that caused the coal miners to revolt. Just as the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company dominated the southern
Colorado coalfields and the entire economic, political, and social life of the community, so the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company completely controlled the copper mining area of the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan.
It produced 60% of the district's copper output and was the dominant employer, setting the prevailing labor policies. C&H gained a reputation for paternalism by providing the miners with reasonably decent housing at nominal rents, in addition to free libraries, gymnasiums, and public baths.
Medicines were also provided free, and there were other benefits as well. 1 But in the mines, the workers were at the mercy of arrogant and tyrannical petty bosses and of efficiency experts who watched their every move and called repeatedly for speed up.
Wages were low, barely averaging $2.50 to $3.00 per day, and the miners were subjected to numerous deductions from their wages which left them in a continual state of impoverishment and debt.
Many miners were able to make at best only $15 to $18 for a 6-day week.
Working hours were 10 a day, but delays in transporting men underground added as much as 1 hour to the daily time spent below the surface. The result was that the so-called 10-hour day was in reality an 11-hour day. 2. Every aspect of the copper miners' lives in Michigan was dominated by the mine owners. Miners' children attended company schools, where they were taught by company teachers. The miners attended company churches and read a company-owned newspaper. They lived in company houses and were expected to buy at company stores. The company controlled the village, the county, and much of the state government. 3. While conceding that Calumet and Hecla had done a great deal of welfare work, an investigator for the U.S. Department of Labor concluded, only one thing appeared to be lacking, and that is the right of the workers to be free men in every sense of the word. 4. William D. Big Bill Haywood, who knew copper mining conditions better than most, was much blunter. In August 1910, he described the copper miners of Michigan as living in a state of feudalism, and concluded that the dominating influence of the company in all walks of life has bred servility on the part of the miners. The spirit of the slave was not confined to any one of the many nationalities among the Michigan copper miners. It was evident among the English-speaking Cornishmen, the Irish or U.S. born, who usually held the better jobs in the mines, and the non-English-speaking Croatians, Slovenians, Poles, Italians, Austrians, and others of the 30 different nationalities in the mines. Although the Finns were decidedly more progressive, and there was a local socialist club, composed of members of the Finnish community, they, too, Haywood noted, were less militant in Michigan than their counterparts in the western mining camps. 5. Still, Haywood did concede that the wage slaves in the Michigan copper mines were awakening and organizing. 6. He was referring to the fact that although the miners had shown little interest in joining the Western Federation of Miners when it had sent organizers into the district in 1904, 5 years later, they themselves had requested the Union to return. It did, and by the summer of 1913, the WFM had 5 locals in the area, with the greatest membership among the underground miners and the trammers, the men who pushed the loaded tramcars to the lifts. 7.
But the mine owners were so confident that they had nothing to fear from unionism that they proceeded to arouse further discontent by discarding the 2-man drill and replacing it with the 1-man drill.
A single man now had to set up a drill weighing from 135 to 150 pounds. The 1-man drill, moreover, deprived the miner working alone of protection in case of an emergency as he had had before with a drill that required 2 men. Most miners bitterly called the 1-man drill the man killer and the widow maker. It also made unemployment, since 1 man could now do what 2 had done before. Although the hard rock miners were ready to strike, the Western Federation of Miners urged a conciliatory policy, pointing out that only about 1/2 of the underground men were organized, and less than that at Calumet and Hecla. The Union recommended caution until a new organizational drive could enable it to take on the powerful copper barons of northern Michigan. But the rank-and-file miners called for action, and in mid-July, 1913, the WFM leaders sent an identical letter to each of the company's top officials, asking for a meeting to discuss possibilities of shortening the working day, raising wages and making some changes in the working conditions. The letter asked for a reply by no later than July 21. Although the request did not spell out any specific demands and talked only in generalities, not one of the mining companies even acknowledged it, and one, the Quincy, returned the envelope unopened. 9. Writing to President Woodrow Wilson, Secretary of Labor William B. Wilson observed, when the miners selected a committee in order to present their grievances, their request was entirely ignored, not even a reply made to it. That precipitated the strike. 10 For the miners in Calumet, Houghton, and the other mining localities now only had one choice, to submit totally to the owners or to strike.
On July 21, 1913, the deadline passed, and on the following day, the miners met and called a strike for July 23.
Their demands were for an 8-hour working day, a minimum wage of $3 a day for underground workers, an increase of 35 cents a day for those who worked above the ground, abolition of the 1-man drill, and recognition of the Western Federation of Miners. Pickets were stationed at all the mines, and by the end of the first day of the strike, all 21 mines in the district were shut down and 16,000 miners were out. 11. Although Sheriff Jam S.A. Cruz had sworn in extra deputies even before the strike broke out and had added loyal company officials on the day of the strike, he used the excuse of a number of brief clashes between the strikers and non-union miners to bring in the state militia. Arguing that the situation in the strike district was out of control, the sheriff appealed to Governor Woodbridge N. Ferris to immediately send in 2,000 National Guardsmen. Between July 24 and 27, the entire National Guard of Michigan arrived in the strike area. There were 334 men and 211 officers, all under the command of Brigadier General P. L. Abbey. In addition to the infantry, there were 2 troops of cavalry, 1 company of engineers, 2 ambulance companies, and 3 brass bands. They encamped on land belonging to the mine companies. The militiamen were armed with riot sticks, sabers, pistols, and Springfield rifles. They also had 2 automatic machine guns with them. It appeared that they were preparing for a real war, and indeed the guard officers were convinced that the training their men would receive in the strike zone would be of inestimable service in case hostilities break out between the United States and Mexico. In that event, the Michigan troops would be the first sent to the front, because their strike service was exactly the same as they would receive in the field in time of actual warfare. 12. The mine operators were also busy bringing in armed men to supplement the state troops. Almost 2,000 deputy sheriffs were sworn in, many of them in the employ of the mine companies, and a large number of strike-breaking detectives were brought in from New York City. These men were supplied by the notorious Waddell Mahan Agency, which billed itself as an organization that specializes in labor disputes. So confident was James Waddell that his thugs and gunmen would break the strike that he sent out a circular to a number of large corporations, asking them to watch the progress of the present strike, because we know it will be a triumph for law and order, a triumph for the mine owners, and will furnish still another evidence of the success we have always met in breaking strikes. 13. To keep the mines open, a large number of strikebreakers were brought into Michigan. Many were engaged through the Austro-American Labor Agency in New York City and were recent German immigrants, few of whom could read English.
They were not told that they were to act as strikebreakers and were unaware even of the existence of the strike.
They were escorted into the strike area by deputy sheriffs and the National Guard. Some of them tried to escape and later testified that they were held under guard as virtual prisoners and were not allowed to leave the bunkhouse. 14. Dressed in their Sunday best, with their wives and children at their sides, the strikers paraded every morning from the Miners' Union Hall to the mines and picketed peacefully outside the various shafts. Labor leaders from outside the area, including the aged Mother Jones and the young John Lewis of the United Mine Workers, joined the parades. At the head of every day's parade marched Anna Clemming, wife of a Croatian copper miner, carrying a silk American flag. Known as Big Annie, or Tall Annie, she was in her early 20s when the strike began, and she was hailed as an American Joan of Arc, because of her fervent support of the strikers.
Annie was attacked more than once by infantrymen with bayoneted
guns, by cavalrymen with drawn sabers, and by Waddell-trained deputies with pistols and clubs. Their aim was to get her to drop the American flag she carried at the head of the miners' parades. But Annie stood her ground. "Kill me," she once shouted to the infantrymen and deputies as they tried to seize her flag. "Run your bayonets and sabers through this flag and kill me, but I won't move.
If this flag will not protect me, then I will die with it." The attackers were forced to retreat.
On another occasion, when two soldiers struck her with their bayonets, one on the wrist and the other on her breast, to force her to drop the flag she was carrying, she raised the staff horizontally, letting its folds fall down in front, and said, "Go ahead now, do your work, shoot me.
I am willing to die behind the flag.
If you don't respect the flag, I do." This time, one of the soldiers, upon seeing that she was not to be scared and driven from the field, clubbed her over the shoulder with the stock. But a number of the strikers, seeing that she was in real danger, pushed her out of the soldier's path. In its description of the incident, the Miners' Bulletin, the strikers' organ, commented, in recognition of the heroism of Anna Clemming, Captain Blackman declared that she should have her head knocked off, a remark eminently worthy of this soldier. 16. In September, the mine owners succeeded in securing an injunction against picketing and parading in any attempt to prevent the entrance of strikebreakers into the mines. Judge P. H. O'Brien of the Circuit Court dissolved the injunction, thereby bringing social ostracism upon himself and his family, but the Michigan Supreme Court promptly ordered it restored. The National Guard enforced the injunction, and those who attempted to disobey it were quickly arrested. 17. One of those arrested was Big Annie. In A Woman's Story, published in the Miners' Bulletin of October 2, 1913, she described what had happened. She had met several workers who were going into the mines and had peacefully urged one of them, "Oh, George, you are not going to work, are you? Come stay with us. Stick to us and we will stick to you." He stepped back, she added, willing to comply with my request. At this point, the deputies came along, caught him by the shoulder and dragged him with them, saying, "You coward, are you going back because a woman told you not to go to work?" 8 or 10 of the deputies pulled him along with them. A militia officer then said, "Annie, you have to get away from here." "No, I am not going," she shot back. "I have a right to stand here and quietly ask the scabs not to go to work." A woman's story continues. "I was standing to one side of the crowd and he said, 'You will have to get in the auto. I won't go until you tell me the reason.' Then he made me get in the auto. I kept pounding the automobile with my feet and asking what I was being taken to jail for. The officer said, 'Why don't you stay at home?' I won't stay at home. My work is here, nobody can stop me. I am going to keep at it until this strike is won." I was kept in jail from 6:30 till 12, then released under bond. At about this time, Kate Richards O'Hare, the socialist editor and organizer, visited the strike area. Her shocked report in the National Ripsaw of December, 1913, entitled, "War in the Copper Country," went in part. Though Michigan is a civilized, Christian state, with a constitution and statutes and a full corps of law enforcers and officials, I found that there was no law in the copper country except the will of the copper barons and that human life had no protection except that of a good strong arm and a handy club. Men could be beaten down, women assaulted and young girls forced to listen to the most degenerate and revolting language, and the law of Michigan was dead and its enforcers were too busy protecting profits to take notice. I stood in front of the courthouse and saw strikers, including men and women, driven into jail like droves of sheep into the shambles. Men were clubbed and beaten like wild beasts, and beautiful young girls dragged through the ranks of deputies, subjected to vile insults and jammed into jail, trailing their American flags behind them. As I watched them I thought of old Betsy Ross, and wondered if from that other side of life one may look back upon this one, what she thought of the depths to which her stars and stripes had fallen. All this time, the mine operators were refusing to have any dealings with the Western Federation of Miners officers or with anyone carrying a union card. Calumet and Hecla President Quincy A. Shaw refused even to leave Boston and come to Calumet to talk with the strikers. He preferred to let the armed gunmen and thugs from the Waddell Agency do the talking for the company. One night, 5 of the gunmen surrounded a house in the small village of Sevierville and fired indiscriminately into it. 2 men in the house were killed, 2 others seriously wounded, and a 6-month-old baby, held in its mother's arms, was grazed by a bullet. But even this was only the beginning. "Nowhere in the United States, not even in West Virginia," wrote James Lord after returning from Michigan, "have the mine owners with their hireling courts and soldiers and imported murderers, gone to greater lengths to defeat the just demands of the workers." As a result of public pressure, the gunmen in the Sevierville tragedy were arrested and later convicted of manslaughter. But these 6 men, and a deputy who shot a 14-year-old girl marching in a picket parade, were the only non-strikers arrested during the strike. On the other hand, over 600 strikers were arrested, most on the charge of intimidating an officer or inciting a riot. Another 500 were arrested for violating the injunction against picketing and parading. As an investigator for the U.S. Department of Labor pointed out, when the strikers mistreated the men that went to work during the strike, they were arrested and fined, imprisoned or bound over. But when peace officers, deputy sheriffs, soldiers or Waddell men engaged in conflicts with the strikers and the officers were the aggressors in beating or riding down the strikers, there was no one to arrest the officers. State officials and the U.S. Department of Labor made efforts to mediate the strike, but while the union accepted, the operators adamant. Why refused to meet with the WFM? The manager for Calumet and Hecla gave the typical company answer. These men, the strikers, can find employment elsewhere. If they do not want to subscribe to the conditions that we impose, they are perfectly free to go to other places. 19. In late November, a citizens' alliance was formed by local merchants and others who wished to help the copper companies drive unionism out of the district. Members were required to sign a pledge which read in part, I believe the presence of the Western Federation of Miners is a menace to the future welfare and prosperity of this district, and that therefore in the interest of law, order and peace, the Western Federation of Miners must go. 20. Facing a cold winter with the prospect of eviction by their mine owner landlords, some strikers gave up and returned to the mines. But the overwhelming majority held fast, although their bitterness found expression at times in violent attacks on strikebreakers.
On a night early in December 1913, 3 newly arrived Canadian strikebreakers were killed by shots fired into the house at Painterdale where they were staying. Inflamed by the slayings and concerned about further losses in trade, the Citizens' Alliance began holding mass meetings demanding an end to the strike.
Local merchants who were Alliance members now threatened to cut off all further credit to strikers. 21 inches Big Annie Clemming had earlier been arrested for assaulting scabs, tried for assault and battery, and found guilty. However, her sentencing was delayed until January 1914. Upon her release on bail, she and other strikers' wives formed a WFM women's auxiliary called the Women's
Alliance, which sent appeals to unions in different parts of the country. In mid-January, she entered the county jail to serve her term.
Soon, clothing, candy, and other gifts for the strikers' children's Christmas party began to pour in. The Italian Hall in Red Jacket was obtained for the party. 3 Christmas trees were set up and a local Santa Claus was hired.
On the afternoon of December 24th, 700 to 800 people, including several hundred children, filled the second floor of the
Italian Hall.
Lunch was followed by the Christmas party. One by one, the children met Santa Claus, and each received a gift. Just as the party was about to break up, someone rushed into the hall and yelled, "Fire!
Fire!
Fire!" Panic ensued, and in a matter of seconds, the narrow staircase was jammed with children and adults, pushing, shoving, and screaming. People stumbled and fell, and soon the narrow stairway was jammed with bodies.
Firemen, alerted by an alarm, rushed to the scene and began pulling children off the top of the pile.
When it was over, 62 children and 11 adults were dead.
There had been no fire. But it was never determined by either the coroner's jury or a later congressional investigating committee who it was that had cried out the tragic words or why he had done so. Charges that the guilty party had worn a Citizens' Alliance button on his coat were never substantiated.
Editors of the Finnish language paper Tiemies issued an extra edition containing this charge and stated further that deputies had blocked rescue efforts while Citizens' Alliance members watched and cheered. The editors were promptly arrested on a charge of sedition for making these statements. 22. Woody Guthrie's moving ballad, The 1913 Massacre, closed with this stanza.
The piano played a slow funeral tune.
And the town was lit up by a cold Christmas moon. The parents they cried and the miners they moaned, see what your greed for money has done. 23.
As a shocked nation read the story of the Italian Hall disaster, offers of aid began to pour into the strike area. In a sudden burst of sympathy for the stricken families, Calumet and Hecla contributed $5,000 for their relief, and Citizens' Alliance members and other residents raised another $20,000 to $25,000. These funds were offered to strikers who had lost members of their families. 24 But the strikers called the relief funds blood money, and when the delegation bearing them approached the homes, although no copy of Tiomies carrying the charges is available, the International
Socialist Review, Volume 14, February, 1914, pp. 458-59, published an English translation of the statements appearing in the Finnish paper. Of the bereaved families, they were told that the strikers and their union would take care of their own.
WFM President Charles Moyer, who was in Hancock, backed these statements with one of his own in which, after indicating that it was not outside the realm of possibility that a Citizens' Alliance agent had raised the false fire alarm, he said that the Western Federation of Miners will bury its own dead and the American labor movement will take care of the deceased. 25. Labor and socialist papers applauded both Moyer's statement and the stand taken by the stricken families. The socialist Milwaukee leader declared that the bereaved strikers, in rejecting the charity of the very men who have been trying and are now seeking to starve them into the submission of the whipped slave, spoke as becomes men who are worthy to be free and who are worthy of the support of their fellow workers. 26.
The Citizens' Alliance, however, was enraged.
An Alliance delegation visited Moyer in his hotel room in Hancock and demanded that he retract his charge against the Alliance and instruct the families to take what had been collected.
When he refused, he was warned by Sheriff James Cruz that if he stuck to his position, the sheriff could no longer be responsible for his safety. No sooner had the sheriff left when Moyer and another Union official were seized by a gang of armed men wearing Citizens' Alliance buttons, and were beaten and shot at. Moyer suffered a flesh wound. Bloody and beaten, he and the other Union official were dragged out of the hotel, and the two were driven to the railroad station a mile away, where they were thrown into the night train bound for Chicago.
Upon his arrival in Chicago, Moyer had to be hospitalized for 10 days. 27 inches. Moyer shot, slugged, and deported from Calumet District. Read the next day's headlines.
As far as the majority of the Michigan newspapers were concerned, Moyer got what he deserved.
Everything that happened in the Copper District was absolutely the fault of outside agitators working among the foreign element, and Moyer, as president of the Western Federation of Miners, was the leading outside agitator. 28. The Houghton County Grand Jury was specifically charged by Judge O'Brien to investigate the kidnapping and shooting, but no one was ever indicted. 29.
On the Sunday after Christmas, mass services were held for the dead children and adults.
Then, with 50,000 people in the procession, the funeral wound its way to the Lakeview Cemetery, 2 miles away. At the head of the long procession, carrying the same American flag she had borne so many times in the strikers' parades, walked Annie Clemming. Tears streaming from her eyes.
At the cemetery, most of the victims were placed in 2 mass graves, one Catholic and the other Protestant.
The graves were dug by the strikers themselves. 30. On January 10, 1914, Secretary of Labor William B. Wilson made public a report on the Michigan strike by Walter B. Palmer, a Labor
Department investigator.
Affidavits by miners published in the report showed that they had been forced into peonage. Calumet and Hecla, it was disclosed, had made enormous profits, while paying the miners the lowest wages in the industry. Then, on January 12, the Chicago Tribune published material from Palmer's report which had not been included in Secretary Wilson's original statement. In it were stories of drunkenness among militiamen who had been allowed to wander around armed in this condition, of violence resulting in fatalities provoked by imported deputies, of lack of provisions for safety and sanitation in the mines, of work imposed on trammers in the mines which soon permanently disabled them, and of the fact that houses had been sold to employees by Calumet and Hecla built on leased ground, with one condition of the lease being that if the lessor should cease to be an employee of the company by discharge or otherwise, he could be dispossessed and the company could take possession of his house and land. 31. These disclosures revealed that industrial feudalism, rather than industrial paternalism, prevailed in the copper mines. They also produced a congressional investigation, and for 2 months, a congressional committee held hearings in the strike district, adding new information about the poor working conditions in the mines. 32. But these disclosures had no effect on the employers, who made it clear that they would still have nothing to do with the Western Federation of Miners. Indeed, the union officials appeared to have given up all hope of winning the strike and even informed members of the congressional committee that it was doubtful if further disclosures would do any good. All they wanted, they said, was for the employers to take back the remaining strikers without requiring them to give up their union membership. 33. As the hearings drew to a close, the union announced a cutback of strike benefits. From the outset of the strike, the WFM had furnished one committee member asked a WFM official, "Do I understand that you want to have the committee make a report in which they would make no criticism of these alleged man-killing machines, unsanitary conditions in the mines, as to which there has been evidence introduced here that they are unhealthful, that a man could not live more than 5 or 6 or 7 years? All those things to be relegated to the rear as mere incidents. U.S. Congress, Committee on Mines and Mining, Conditions in Copper Mines of Michigan, Senate. Document number 381, Volume 8, pp. 113-14. Strike relief, but it soon found that practically every striker needed such assistance. The wages paid to the copper miners of the Northern Peninsula having been so low, the union noted, almost immediately after the declaring of the strike, many of those involved found themselves without visible means of support and began drawing relief. With assessments on the WFM membership providing less than half of the amount required, the union was compelled to borrow $25,000 from the United Brewery Workers and $100,000 from Illinois District No. 12 of the United Mine Workers. It was also helped by a liberal response to its appeals to organized labor, especially from the United Mine Workers, and it was able to sustain the copper miners of Michigan for 9 months. 34.
By April 2, however, the union found that donations from most trade unions had dried up, while the United Mine Workers, with troubles of its own in Colorado and Ohio, could no longer send funds.
The WFM Executive Board thereupon informed the strikers that relief would have to be reduced immediately, and that if they were willing to accept the serious reduction and continue the strike, the union would help to the best of its ability, but that not very much could be expected. 35. On April 12, 1914, the remaining strikers took a vote and by a 3-1 margin, decided to end the strike. The WFM announced the results emotionally and dramatically to the entire union membership. Your striking members, after considering the situation, and while it was a cruel blow to them, and almost an impossible thing to do, yet, realizing the impossibility of continuing to supply their wives and little ones with the necessaries of life under the reduced relief, have, after fighting one of the most determined battles in the history of industrial conflicts in this country for a period of 9 months, declared the strike at an end and will return to their employment under such conditions as they are able to secure. 36. The union took some comfort in the fact that the strikers had forced the copper magnates to concede that their claim for an 8-hour workday, an increase of wages and the regulating of working conditions was just. This was a reference to the fact that early in December, the companies had instituted an 8-hour day, raised wages, and announced the establishment of a grievance procedure. Although the men had been forced to renounce their union membership as a condition of getting their jobs back, the WFM proclaimed that with the concessions made in hours and wages, their struggle has not been in vain. 37. As far as the Western Federation of Miners itself was concerned, however, the strike in Michigan had brought only total failure. The union was eliminated entirely from the Michigan copper country, and it was to take another quarter of a century before unionism would return to the district. 38 The Western Federation of Miners suffered another setback in 1914, this time in Butte, Montana, the union's original stronghold. A complicated struggle involving IWW intervention led to the union's collapse in Butte with a considerable loss of revenue. Chapter 11. Revolt of the Garment Workers, I. Uprising of the Wastemakers. On November 24, 18,000 wastemakers in Manhattan and Brooklyn, New York walked out of nearly 500 shops. By the end of the day, over 20,000 workers had joined the pickets. This great uprising served as a catalyst for workers in other branches of the industry. And it spearheaded the drive that turned the shells of unions into mass organizations, thereby laying the foundation for stable and lasting organizations in the women's and men's clothing industries and for the widespread unionization of women workers. The manufacture of shirtwaists was a comparatively new branch of the garment trade which had developed rapidly after 1900, especially in New York and Philadelphia. By 1909, there were about 600 waist and dress shops in New York City employing from 35 to 40,000 workers. About 80% of them were young women between the ages of 16 and 25, most of them unmarried, 2/3 of them Jewish, with a couple of thousand Italians and a few hundred black workers. Men accounted only for about 20% of the workers, but they occupied the high-paying jobs that demanded special skill and experience. 1 While dress and waistmakers experienced the typical inequities that were prevalent throughout the industry, working conditions in this segment of the industry were better than those in other branches. Since most of the shops had been set up comparatively recently, they were more sanitary than those in the rest of the industry. Most workrooms contained windows which provided adequate lighting. Wages, too, were generally higher than those in other branches of the trade. However, they varied both from shop to shop and within shops, depending on skill and on the system of work which prevailed.
The latter, in turn, was determined by piecework, except for the more highly skilled workmen who represented only from 15 to 20% of the labor force.
Despite the fact that by the end of 1909, the industry was prosperous, wage rates had fallen steadily since the 1908 depression. Thus, early in 1908, a woman machine operator on wastes could earn as much as $12 or $13 a week at piece rates, while late in 1909, she was lucky to make $9 or $10. In addition, workers received their wages directly from inside subcontractors who negotiated individually with the manufacturer. Asterisk. This system inevitably created inequities in the pay scale. Some women received only $3 or $4 per week, while others, who worked directly for the manufacturer, received as much as $15 or $20 per week. As in other branches, wages fluctuated because of the seasonal nature of the industry.
The worker's annual income was cut considerably by enforced idleness for 3 months of the year.
One contemporary study found that the average weekly wage for the industry was $9, but since this was not for the entire year but only for the busy season, it brought the average down to only $5, and this was for 56 to 59 hours work each week, with only the usual rate for overtime. 2. The industry subcontractors, men who hired from 3 to 8 girl helpers, exploited the very young girls through an oppressive system of apprenticeship. The workers were subjected to strict discipline. Subcontractors and examiners levied fines for lateness and for sewing errors. "In the shops we don't have names," declared one wastemaker, "we have numbers." Manufacturers charged for needles and thread often as much as $1.50 a week, as well as for electric power, for the chairs the workers sat on, and for the lockers in the shops, all at a substantial profit. They fined their employees half a day's pay for being a few minutes late, or for accidentally spoiling a piece of cloth. A ticket system prevailed under which a worker, after completing a task or piece, would receive a small tag, which was to be turned in at the end of a period in return for her wages. Most workers complained that the manufacturers deliberately made the tag or ticket very small, hoping that some of the subcontracting was a variation of the traditional contracting system in the garment trades. Like the contractor, the subcontractor contracted with a manufacturer to complete a specified amount of work for an agreed-upon price. Like the contractor, too, he supervised a team of workers in completing the bundles of garments. Unlike the contractor, however, the subcontractor did not own a shop but worked in the manufacturer's large inside establishments. Subcontractors, not manufacturers, were responsible for paying their workers, and when manufacturers lowered rates, the subcontractors passed the decrease on to their teams of workers.
Workers would lose them. And this is exactly what happened, and as a result, workers often received pay for only part of their work.
Because the industry operated on a piecework basis, the employer or his agent could easily show favoritism to cooperative workers by giving them larger bundles of work. To top it all off, the entire abusive _STEM was characterized by tyrannical bosses, nagging, pet mess, espionage, favoritism, rudeness, and discourtesy. 3. Local 25 of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union (ILGWU) had jurisdiction over the wastemakers. Although it had been founded in 1906 by 7 young girls and 6 men, the local had failed to attract many workers. Just 4 weeks before the strike, the secretary-treasurer, organizer and walking delegate of the founding union noted that the membership barely reached 800 workers who were described as irregular and unenthusiastic.
Few of them had any knowledge of union organization.
To be sure, members of the women's trade Union League had helped small groups of dressmakers learn the principles and practices of unionism and had convinced a group of them to affiliate with Local 25 in 1908. However, men controlled the union, holding all the offices and 8 of the 15 positions on the executive board. 4. Nevertheless, unrest had been building steadily and visibly for at least the Women's Trade Union League was founded in Boston's historic Faneuil Hall by a group of trade unionists and liberal professional social workers interested in the organization of women. Among them were Mary Kenny O'Sullivan, formerly a general organizer for the AFL, and William English Walling, a settlement house social worker. Impressed by the accomplishments of the Women's Trade Union League of Great Britain in assisting in the organization of working women, the League's founders in America sought to solve three basic problems facing working women in this country: the unionization of women, the education of the unions to the need for organizing them, and the enactment of protective legislation for working women and children. In 1904, state branches were formed in Illinois, Massachusetts, and New York, and by 1911, the League had grown to 11 branches. The New York League helped to organize more unions than any other League branch. From 1904 to 1912, it organized or helped to organize unions among the hat trimmers, embroidery workers, textile workers, bakery and confectionery workers, white goods workers, straw hat makers, laundry workers, shirtwaist workers, and paper box makers.
While women of independent means were important in the work of the National League and the state branches, working women emerged as important figures too. Women like
Rose Schneiderman of the cap makers, Emma Stegagen of the shoe workers, Agnes
Nestor and Elizabeth Christman of the glove workers, Melinda Scott of the hat trimmers,
Josephine Casey of the railway ticket takers, Stella Franklin of the department store clerks, Elizabeth Maloney of the waitresses, and Maud Swartz of the typographers. F. The origin and a brief history of the Women's Trade Union League before 1909, c. Philip S. Foner, History of the Labor Movement in the United States, Vol. 3, New York, 1964, pp. 228-3L. A year before the uprising.
Throughout late 1908 and 1909, walkouts
became increasingly frequent in the large waste factories in the Washington Square area. Confrontations between manufacturers and workers over wage and piece rate cuts, subcontracting, and the practice of charging workers for electricity, needles, and other materials became increasingly sharp. Late July, 19,091. He 200 employees of the Rosen B Rothers La AIST high greater than P walked out on strike in protest against unatypical pay scales. During the strike, thugs assaulted pickets, and the police, obviously ACE_G at the employer's request, arrested girls who shouted, "Scab," at strikebreakers. However, the strikers' perseverance brought results, for on August 26, Rosen brothers capitulated. The victorious strikers gained full union recognition and a 20% wage increase. 5. Early in September, the strike spread to additional shops and grew in intensity.
150 young women walked out of the
Liserson factory, accusing their employer of paying starvation wages. The strike also spread to the Triangle Waste Company, which was to become nationally infamous in 1911 because of the tragic fire on its premises. After the latter company's owners learned that a few of their employees had joined the union, they promptly locked out the entire shop of 500 workers and advertised for replacements. The infuriated Triangle employees literally besieged Local 25's headquarters and signed up en masse with the union. 6. Although some magistrates conceded that New York state law sanctioned the right to picket, all of them countenanced the arrests and beatings of the striking teenage girls. Every day, scores of pickets were fined or sentenced to the workhouse. On the other hand, the magistrates discharged entire contingents of thugs when they were arrested for assaulting young strikers, in spite of their criminal records. 7. D_P_THT. J. Keelet _A11 Psi of the strikers, it was clique hat shop, shop strikes would not, York, and that only by tying up the entire trade during the busy season could the workers gain their demands. On October 21, 1909, a general meeting of union members was called to discuss the possibilities of a general strike movement in the trade. The assembled delegates declared for a general strike, advanced a program demanding an immediate 10% increase in wages and recognition of the union. The fire at the Triangle Waste Company on Green Street and Washington Place in New York City broke out on March 25, 1911. The bosses, Harris and Blank, kept the factory doors locked during working hours and ignored the union's demands for improvements in these conditions. When fire struck, 500 girls, women, and men in the Triangle shop were trapped, and 145 workers, predominantly young girls, lost their lives. By the employers, and appointed a committee to implement the strategy for a general strike. Even as the union leaders were displaying a reluctance to move, the striking girls of Local 25 received new moral and material support. The United Hebrew Trades, the central organization of Jewish unionists in the city, began a fundraising appeal among trade unionists and succeeded in obtaining pledges from the working shirtwaist employees to give 10 cents each on behalf of the strikers. The Women's Trade Union League of New York City, which had been helping the strikers from the outset of the walkouts, now established a corps of 48 volunteer pickets to assist the strikers. The volunteer pickets, generally women from the upper middle classes, accompanied pickets in order to prevent their unwarranted arrests. They, too, were attacked by the police on the picket line along with the strikers, and some were even arrested. But when the police learned that they were dealing with socially prominent women, they changed their tactics. When Mary Dreyer, the League's president, was arrested by accident, and when her identity was discovered in court, she was quickly released and the arresting officer apologized humbly, asking, "Why didn't you tell me you was a rich lady? I'd never have arrested you in the world." Such obvious bias in favor of the rich was widely publicized by the WTUL and was contrasted with police outrages committed against the strikers, thereby arousing public sympathy for the girls. The police, in turn, grew resentful of the League's support of the strike and kept asking why educated women insisted on involving themselves with lower-class working women strikers. 9. During the weeks of the shop strikes, about 2,000 workers joined the union, and hundreds crowded the cramped union office daily with talk of a general strike.
Now the union, too, began to consider calling a general strike.
Because the New York WTUL had been active in assisting the workers in the Triangle, Lyserson, and Rosen strikes, and because any large undertaking would require the League's financial assistance, the union shared its deliberations with that organization. League leaders were enthusiastic and pledged their support. The two organizations rented Cooper Union for the evening of November 22 to discuss the question of an industry-wide walkout, as well as to protest actions of the struck companies and the police.
Among the speakers scheduled to address the rank-and-file workers were Samuel Gompers, Mary Dreyer, Meyer London, and Ernest Bohm, secretary of the New
York City Central Federated Union. 10. On the night of the meeting, Cooper Union Auditorium was packed with an overflow crowd of shirtwaist workers, and several thousand girls had to be directed to other meeting halls in the general vicinity. _F less than. _R over 2 hours 1 _ tilde tilde th _ tension in the 31. Auditorium mounted, the workers listening i.e. tilde peaker after another urging caution and moderate action. Gompers _J tilde Q JNDED the audience that he always looked up. QN. Tilde trilled _S is the method of last resort. He cautioned the workers against acting too hastily. League, however, if you cannot get the manufacturers to give you what you want, then strike. And when you strike, let the manufacturers know that you are on strike. Wild applause followed this remark, but there was _street il no AC, tion jor tilde G tilde N tilde roll _ tilde trike. Tilde. Then, after TNEAUD tilde tilde NCE had grown tired of hearing one mod _E. 8 voice after another, a young working girl leapt to her feet, marched down the aisle and asked for the floor. The chairman was reluctant to grant her request, but the workers in the audience recognized her as one of the most militant rank-and-filers. Clara Lemlich from Lyserson's, where the workers had already been on strike for 11 weeks. They knew, too, that she had just returned from the hospital after having been brutally beaten on the picket line. The workers insisted that she be allowed to speak even though her name did not appear on the program.
Barely 5 feet tall and not more than 20 years old, she spoke in impassioned Yiddish, the native tongue of the majority of the shirtwaist workers, and proceeded to berate the cautious speakers who had held the platform during the evening.
She concluded, "I have listened to all the speakers, and I have no further patience for talk.
I am one who feels and suffers from the things pictured.
I move we go on a general strike." Instantly, The crowd was on its feet, women, men, and girls cheering, stamping, crying approval. Chairman Feigenbaum called for a vote. 3,000 voices shouted their unanimous approval, waving hats, handkerchiefs, and other objects.
"Do you mean faith?" cried the chairman. "Will you take the old
Hebrew oath?" 3,000 right arms shot up, and 3,000 voices repeated the Yiddish words, "If I turn traitor to the cause I now pledge, may this hand wither from the arm I now raise." Meanwhile, messengers carried the news of the Cooper Union meeting to Beethoven Hall and the other halls where the wastemakers had gathered. There the _strict_EV, tilde was ratified just as Enthusiasty tilde LLY, 11, and thus began the famous labor struggle which has become known as the QP tilde Eisen _G, _FFW tilde Ihausen, and H tilde SL, greater than een describectes, women's most significant struggle for unionism in the nation's history. 12. Both Local 25 and the WTUL were stunned by the wastemakers' response to the general strike call. At most, they had expected 4,000 or 5,000 Jewish workers to strike. 13 Instead, on the first day, 18,000 shirtwaist workers came out in response to the strike call. Girls by the thousands stormed the small union office on Clinton Street to enroll in Local 25. Soon, nearly 30,000 operators, cutters, pressers, and finishers were on strike. Although 4/5 of the female strikers were Jewish women, several thousand Italian and native-born U.S. women participated as well. Many small waste manufacturers, unable to stand even a short interruption during the busy season, were soon parading to union headquarters to sign agreements with the union. These agreements included a provision for a union shop, a 52-hour week, limitation of overtime work, equal division of work among union members, and a price list of changing styles to be fixed by conference between employer, employee, and union representatives. In addition, the employers promised to employ only contractors who used union labor, to furnish machines, needles, thread, and other supplies, and to allow a weekly check of their payroll by union officials. Any party violating the agreement would have to pay a $300 penalty. By the time the strike was hardly 4 days old, almost half the original 20,000 strikers had won improved conditions, including union contracts, and had returned to work. 14. Because many employers made quick settlements, Local 25 and the WTUL were optimistic that the strike would be short and spectacularly successful. But the employers who settled at once were those who could not afford a protracted work stoppage. The larger firms that dominated the industry were determined to fight it out to the bitter end. They formed the Association of Waste and Dress Manufacturers of New York and, on November 27, declared open war against the union, recruiting strikebreakers and vowing to hold against a settlement. A member of the association warned that a trade agreement with the union was not worth the paper it was written upon. The association urged estimates of the number of strikers range from the New York State Department of Labor Bureau of Mediation and Arbitration figure of 15,000 to Local 25's estimate of 40,000. The estimate of 30,000 is based on Helen Merritt's calculation based on WTUL records. Helen Merritt, A Woman's Strike, An Appreciation of the Shirtwaist Makers of New York, Proceedings of the Academy of Political Science, City of New York, Volume I, 1910, p. 122. The report on the strike in the Annual Report 1909-1910 of the Women's Trade Union League of New York is entitled, The League and the Strike of the 30,000, New York, 1910, p. 11. Employers who had signed agreements to repudiate them and warned that only manufacturers who opposed unionism would be eligible for membership in the employers' organization. We insist upon the open shop, the president declared, and from that stand we will not budge. 15. Thus, very early, the strike led DQWN to a protracted campaign of siege fair against the larger firms. It required a good deal of spirit _ND devotion to unionism to maintain this siege. The winter of 1909-10 was exceptionally frigid and snowy in New York City. Many a frostbitten young picket was taken directly to the hospital or clinic. In addition, the ILGWU, then only 9 years old, was not yet firmly established and had a scanty treasury, so that regular strike benefits were few and far between and the strikers were hard put to meet their rent and grocery bills. Actually, most of the original $60,000 strike fund and of the funds collected during the strike had to be used to pay the fines of girls convicted by biased magistrates. 16. The members of the association tried to break the strike by exploiting Jewish and Italian antagonisms and sought to drive a wedge between the girls by keeping black workers on the job, by importing professional strikebreakers, or by arrangements with out-of-town plants, particularly in Philadelphia, to supply them with goods.
But they depended primarily on brute force, arrests, and convictions.
By December 22, 1909, over 700 pickets had been brutally arrested, 19 were sentenced to the workhouse on Blackwell's Island on charges of disorderly conduct and vagrancy, and the rest were fined. At Blackwell's Island, the young girls were thrown into cells with prostitutes, degenerates, and criminals. 17. A magistrate summed up the prevailing attitude of the courts in these words: "You have no right to picket. Every time you go down there you will get what is coming to you and I shall not interfere." Regardless of the evidence, or lack of it, the girls were usually convicted. When prosecutors failed to substantiate their charge that N.N.E. Bloom had assaulted a forelady, Magistrate Joseph Corrigan fined her $10 for disorderly conduct and stated that if more strikers appeared before him, he would send them to the workhouse.
When one girl was tried for the offense of calling a strikebreaker a scab, the presiding magistrate told her,
"If these girls continue to rush around and cry, 'Scab,' I shall convict them of disorderly conduct." There is no word in the English language as irritating as the word scab. Another magistrate declared bluntly that while the higher courts have held that strikers had the right to employ pickets and call names, he personally would forbid the right to picket. Still another magistrate told a group of bruised and bleeding girls, "You are on strike against God and nature, whose prime law is that man shall earn his bread in the sweat of his brow." Members of the WTUL cabled this remark to George Bernard Shaw, who replied, "Delightful."
Medieval America is always in the most intimate personal confidence of the
Almighty. 18. The cruel treatment of the girl strikers failed to dampen their spirit. "There never was anything like it," one union official declared in amazement. "An equal number of men never would hold together under what these girls are enduring." 19. It was precisely because women, who were not expected to take either their jobs or unionism seriously, were such militant strikers that the press expressed such amazement and devoted so much space to the Wastemakers' uprising. The New York Women's Trade Union League, in its role as liaison between the strikers and the public, capitalized on the fact that the majority of the strikers were women. Members circulated detailed reports of police attacks on peaceful pickets and kept a careful tally of arrests. They described the callousness of police magistrates who sentenced young women to several weeks of hard labor for offenses as minor as yelling, "Scab," at strikebreakers. The League volunteered legal services in police courts, provided witnesses for arrested strikers, cross-examined those who testified, raised $9,000 in bail, and acted as a complainant at police headquarters. On December 6, the League established a strike headquarters. League leaders encouraged women whom the police had arrested to come in and report their experiences in detail. From these reports, they drew up rules for pickets designed to encourage safe and legal methods that would minimize the chances of arrest. League members distributed copies of the rules to all strikers so that they could study them daily. 20. On Decem-R20, th_JT Ike spread to P_HJ less than KLP.HIA. Leaders of Local 25 had suspected for some ILRILMAT new Y-ARC manufacturers were sending materials to Philadelphia for completion. ILGWU officials visited Philadelphia in November and early December and determined to halt the manufacture of goods destined for New York. However, the
Philadelphia strike grew, basically, out of the same deplorable conditions that existed in New York.
The conditions of the 15,000 wastemakers in Philadelphia were summed up in an interview with an 18-year-old waymaker, who told a reporter for the Public Ledger that she had gone into the shops 7 years earlier when she was only 11 years old. When there was plenty of work, she could sometimes earn as much as $9 a week, but in the summer she could not average more than $3, and some weeks she made so little as to have just enough to pay car fare. Some days she would earn only 30 or 35 cents. Then there were the petty exactions. 2 cents a week to pay for an outing sponsored by the proprietor every summer, 25 cents for a key to the closet, needles sold at 4 times what they cost, and the tyranny of some of the forewomen, who kept the girls at their machines all day long in the summer time, even when there was no work and they earned nothing.
Excuses of illness made no difference. She would keep you in if you were most dead. 21.
While only 3,500 of the workers belonged to Local 15, officials believed that conditions would lead the non-union workers to walk out if they called a strike. And so, demanding union recognition, a 9-hour day, a 50-hour week, and uniform wages scales, the Philadelphia dress and wastemakers walked out in a general strike. 22.
The Philadelphia strike followed much the same course as that in
New York. The wastemakers faced the same type of guerrillas and police brutality, and the magistrates of Philadelphia were just as eager to sentence pickets to 30 days in the county prison as were their counterparts in New York. The Central Labor Union endorsed the strike, and many trade unions supported it. Throughout their fight, moreover, the striking girls were given support by leading society women and progressive-minded college girls. 23. WTUL leaders Margaret Dreyer Robbins and Agnes Nestor, the latter president of the American Glove Workers Union, hurried from Chicago to Philadelphia.
They opened an office in the heart of the factory district where pickets could report and strikers could receive sandwiches and coffee. The youth and enthusiasm of the Jewish strikers amazed
League members. Day in and day out, despite attacks by the guerrillas and arrests by the police, they were on the picket lines.
On January 14, 1910, the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin reported that a severe snowstorm had hit the city, and added, "Despite the storm, the pickets proved faithful to their duty today."
When Local 15's leaders disclosed that they would be willing to settle without achieving union recognition, they created an uproar among the strikers. The girls insisted upon including the union shop in the settlement, and Agnes Nestor supported their stand. "This sounds like a trick to get you back," she told the pickets. "Don't go into this thing blindly. We have plenty of money and can afford to wait." The Public Ledger called this bravado, pointing out that the treasury of the union is admittedly empty, but conceded that the Philadelphia girl strikers still support the demand for the union shop enthusiastically. 24. With their production virtually at a standstill as a result of the
Philadelphia strike, and with practically every non-association shop having settled with Local 25, the New York Manufacturers Association was more inclined to seek a settlement.
On December 23, a compromise was reached between the employers and the union officials.
The employers conceded the demands of the workers for shorter hours, higher wages, and prompt consideration of an entire list of grievances, but refused to recognize the union or establish the closed or union shop.
The work week would be reduced to 52 hours. There was to be no discrimination against union members. Needles, thread, and appliances were to be supplied free by the employers. As far as practicable, equal work was to be given during the slow seasons. 4 paid holidays annually were to be granted. All shops were to establish wage committees, and all strikers were to be reemployed and no others were to be hired until this was accomplished. The Manufacturers Association agreed that it would give consideration to any communications from any source concerning violations of the agreement and that it would welcome conferences about any differences that could not be settled between the individual shop and its employees. But the president of the association stated that the manufacturers insisted on an open shop, and from that stand we will not budge. 25. On December 2, the negotiated settlement was submitted to a vote of all union members. Since many of the girls working in non-association, independent shops had earlier gained full union recognition, it was hardly to be expected that the strikers in the association shops would settle for less.
Addressing the strikers, Hillquit reminded them that the crux of their demands was union recognition. Collectively the wastemakers are strong, individually they are helpless and defenseless.
If the employers were today to concede all the demands of the strikers, but be allowed to destroy or even to weaken the union, they could and would restore the old condition of servitude in their shops, within a very few weeks or months. It came as no surprise, therefore, that the strikers overwhelmingly disapproved of the proposed settlement. 26. After the rejection, the strike dragged on. While the enthusiasm of the strikers continued at a high pitch, and their determination to win a union shop inspired them to further sacrifice, funds ran low and many of the pickets depended on the WTUL soup kitchen for their meals.
Meanwhile, the arrests continued and so did the fines, which ate up what little remained of the strike fund.
Illness kept many of the girls confined to their beds, while those who still picketed continued to shiver without winter clothing. League members also continued to picket, but their fur hats and coats stood out in sharp contrast to the clothing of the wastemakers. Still, they too suffered during the terrible winter. Vassar graduate Violet Pike, for example, reported daily for either picket or court duty. Her hands deep in her pockets, her beaver hat a bit to the side and an angelic smile on her red lips, she was described as truly the bravest of the brave, day in and day out shivering from cold and at times drenched to the skin. 27. The climax of the New York strike occurred on January 2, 1910 I.
Carnegie Hall.
Originally, several members of the Political Equality Association, led by Anna Shaw and Alva Belmont, had proposed a sympathy strike of all women workers in the city. But when this did not materialize, the Carnegie Hall mass rally was organized. Choose placards hung throughout the concert hall proclaiming that the workhouse is no answer to the demand for justice. Every seat was occupied, and the audience sat spellbound as speaker after speaker heaped accusations and recriminations upon the heads of New York's public officials.
The sponsors had sold box seats to liberal clubs and organizations and netted a substantial amount for the strike fund. On the stage, in the front row, sat 20 strikers who had served sentences in the workhouse.
The 350 young women who had been arrested by the police and fined by the magistrates filled the rest of the stage. Each girl wore a printed sash stating how the court had dealt with her, such as, workhouse prisoner, or, arrested. The high point of the evening came when, after her speech, Leonora O'Reilly led out Rose Purr. No taller than an average girl of 10 years, with her hair braided down her back, she stood before the enormous gathering and told, in simple words, the alarming story of her arrest. The police had taken her to court as a witness because she had asked a police captain to arrest a guerrilla who had slapped her companion. At the courthouse, she was suddenly accused of having assaulted a scab. Without any evidence furnished, the magistrate thereupon sentenced her to 5 days in the workhouse before she even had an opportunity to testify. Hillquit praised the strikers for forming a powerful union practically overnight and fighting a gallant battle to maintain it. He declared that the strike had demonstrated how women permeated industrial life and proved how absurd it was for any man to say that women's place was in the home. Let him remember the 30,000 women strikers of one single industry in one city, and let him remember that in the factories these women are treated with even less consideration than men. But these women, he continued, had shown that they could fight for their rights with heroism. Be of good cheer, your victory will be glorious, he closed to thunderous applause. At the conclusion of his speech, the audience unanimously adopted a resolution condemning the conduct of the police in this case as an indefensible abuse of power, and denouncing the court actions against the strikers as examples of a prejudiced and vindictive mind. The office of magistrate has been perverted into an instrument of persecution and oppression. 29. Following the Great Carnegie Hall meeting, the State Bureau of Mediation attempted to mediate the remaining questions in dispute between the union and the association. While Local 25 was willing to discuss the open or closed shop, the Associated Dress and Waste Manufacturers Association rejected the idea of even discussing the issue. Likewise, on January 11, the association rejected the union's proposal, transmitted through the State Mediation Commissioner, for arbitration hearings by the Commission, which would include consideration of the closed shop. 30. And so the strike dragged on through the bitter cold month of January and into February. As strike benefits dwindled, hunger and deprivation became urgent problems. Then, too, the wealthy women's commitment to the strikers began to waver and diminish after the strikers rejected the settlement offered by the association because it did not include union recognition. By the beginning of February, with the strikers, resources nearing depletion and with the rich society women showing a growing coolness toward the struggle, the end was inevitable. The union was compelled to sign agreements with many of the larger shops without either recognition of the union or endorsement of the union shop. It was on this basis that the Triangle Waste Company settled with the strikers in the first week of February. By the second week of February, almost the entire trade had resumed operation, and those unfortunate few strikers whose stubborn employers refused to sign straggled back to their shops without a contract. Finally, on February 15, even though the association did not recognize the union, Local 25 officials declared the general strike at an end. The great uprising of the shirtwaist makers, which had begun with such fanfare, ended unceremoniously that day without any rejoicing. 31. On February 6, the Philadelphia strike was settled through arbitration between Local 15 and the Philadelphia Manufacturers Association. Under the terms of the settlement, each side nominated 2 members to a board of arbitration, and these 4 chose a 5th impartial member. In the settlement, the employers were not permitted to make any charges for straps, needles, or any other part of the machines, unless they were willfully broken by the operator, and the hours of labor were reduced to 521 h per week. But both wages and the issue of the union shop remained to be arbitrated. The disappointed strikers, who had hoped for more, returned unhappily to their shops. But Agnes Nestor, before returning to Chicago, urged the wastemakers to build up the union so that when the time comes to make another agreement, you will be in a position to get better terms. 32 *. When the strikes in both New York and Philadelphia were over, the ILGWU was able to point with justifiable pride to definite gains made by the strikers. Women who had worked 60 or more hours a week before the strike in New York now had a guaranteed work week of 52 hours, 521 halves of hour in those Philadelphia shops that had settled with the union, and in New York, they were to be paid time and a half for overtime work. Workers no longer had to pay for power and materials, and other petty impositions had also been eliminated. Most importantly, nearly 20,000 had joined Local 25 and 10,000 had become members of Local 15 during the strike. 33. But the strike settlement had obvious limitations, and the wastemakers' contracts were weak. Because many manufacturers had to make individual settlements with the union, and because each shop determined its own piece rate scale, neither conditions nor grievance procedures were standardized. As Hillquit had predicted, the failure to win a union shop opened the door to attempts by employers to restore previous conditions. Within months, wastemakers were coming to the WTUL to report violations, and shop strikes were becoming increasingly common. Unfortunately, a number of union leaders, instead of blaming this on the weaknesses in the settlement, attributed it instead to the main illness of our Jewish organization, strike fever. 34. Despite the strike's less than successful settlement, it did mark a turning point in the history of the union movement among women workers, as well as in the union movement of the garment industry. The strike of the women shirtwaist makers in New York City was both the largest and bitterest strike of women in the history of American labor struggles up to that time. During the 8 weeks of preliminary skirmishing and the 13 weeks of the general strike, the strikers had clearly demonstrated that workers who were usually regarded by leading officials of the AFL, and even by some of the ILGWU, as impossible to organize, could be united in effective economic action. In this struggle, young girls, most of them recent immigrants, working primarily at an unskilled trade, were able to gain from their employers, if not total victory, such important concessions as a 52-hour week, time and a half for overtime, paid holidays, improvements in working conditions, and procedures for setting wages. Without either preparation or finances, the girls had walked the picket lines through the rain and snow, remaining solid in spite of beatings, arrests, fines, and jailings. They had laid the foundation for future gains. Their conditions and struggles had gained the attention of middle-class and well-to-do individuals in New York, And their strike marked the first time these individuals were actively involved in championing the cause of the working masses. 35 The strike pointed up for many New Yorkers the inadequacies of both their police department and the city's judicial system. It awakened many in the city to a new awareness of the problems facing workers in general and working women in particular. The great moral significance of the shirtwaist makers' strike, Morris Hillquit noted, is that it helped awaken our dormant social conscience. The people of this city began to realize that society owes some duties to the toiling masses. 36. Finally, the 3 months of picketing created a solidarity among the women workers and fostered a new awareness of what unity could achieve on the economic front. The girls had gained the understanding that together, they were a powerful force. As one girl phrased it, this is not just a strike for self. Only by standing together can we get better conditions for all. 37. Almost a quarter of a century later, an Ilgwu veteran recalled that in the opening years of the century, the waist and dress shops were the vilest and foulest industrial sores of New York and other big cities. And he went on. Then came 1909. Then came the most heroic labor struggle in the history of the great city. Then came the beginnings of a strong and permanent organization in the needle trades. Then came the beginnings of decency in a vilely sweated industry. 38 These were true words. The impact of the women's strike in the waist-making industry was a tremendous inspiration to the workers in the other branches of the industry and paved the way for the major advances in unionizing other garment workers. Shortly after the end of the strike, the New York City voters replaced Mayor McClellan with Mayor William Gaynor, who undertook a thorough housecleaning of the police department. Chapter 12. Revolt of the Garment Workers. 2. Repercussions. Barely 5 months after the shirtwaist makers had returned to work, another and more extensive general strike paralyzed the ladies' garment trade. In July 1910, some 60,000 workers employed in the cloak and suit branch of the industry left their workbenches en masse and marched to the picket lines. In 1910, cloaks, suits, and shirts were manufactured in about 1,500 shops in New York City, employing approximately 60,000 workers, of whom about 40,000 were Jewish and 10,000 to 20,000 were Italians. After 1890, partly because legislation outlawing homework had virtually ended sweatshops, many small shops had sprung up. The newer clothing factories used lighter, better, and more specialized machinery run by steam or electricity. But despite the disappearance of most sweatshops, factory conditions remained poor. Little provision had been made for adequate sanitary facilities. Workers were still forced to buy their own sewing machines and to pay for repairs, oil, and thread, and inside subcontracting, which prevailed in most of the shops, created a chain of bosses whose common interest was in keeping wages down. In 1910, the average wage for operators was $15 to $18 a week, and for pressers, $14. Men worked for 9 to 9.5 hours a day during the slack season and for 14 to 16 hours a day when the shops were busy. In short, the cloakmaker's life, like that of the shirtwaist maker, was a bitter struggle for existence, for none was this truer than the female workers. Women held 10% of the jobs in this branch of the industry. They played a minor role in cloakmaking, working primarily as helpers in the finishing departments, and earned the woefully inadequate wage of $3 to $4 per week. 1. Unlike the waistmakers' strike, which had been spontaneous and haphazard, the cloakmakers' strike in the summer of 1910 was carefully planned. Unlike Local 25's leaders, the cloakmakers' officers had anticipated the strike, had prepared adequate funds, and enjoyed the full support of the International Union. Strike agitation had begun in August 1908, and by the spring of 1909, about 2,000 members had been recruited into the New York Joint Board of Cloak and Shirt Makers Unions. With the strike of the waistmakers, the movement for a general strike in the cloak and suit trade was ignited and membership in the Joint Board soared. In July 1910, a secret ballot on the general strike issue showed 777 for striking and 615 against, and a committee decided on the following set of demands: union recognition, the 48-hour week, double time for overtime work, and the abolition of subcontracting. 2. When the strike call was issued on July 7, about 60,000 cloakmakers, 6,000 of them women, walked off their jobs in what the press immediately termed the Great Revolt. The Italians, who constituted about a third of the labor force in the industry and who had been involved in all stages of planning and executing the strike, joined the Jewish workers.
Unlike the situation in the shirtwaist strike, which had little prior organization and in which the Italian girls were mainly strikebreakers, the Italians here were organized before the strike began. 3.
The cloakmakers began at once to negotiate with the smaller employers, who could not afford a long, drawn-out conflict and who rushed to arrange satisfactory agreements.
But the larger manufacturers refused to yield.
They were determined that under no circumstances would they grant the demand for union recognition and the closed shop.
A number of the larger cloak manufacturers thereupon formed the Cloak, Suit and
Shirt Manufacturers, Protective Association and pledged not to bargain with the cloakmakers union. 4. Like the shirtwaist makers before them, the cloakmakers soon had to contend with the association's special policemen and thugs, in addition to the New York City Police.
All three groups joined forces in escorting strikebreakers into the struck shops. As in the shirtwaist makers' strike, too, magistrates regularly fined or sentenced pickets to the workhouse, while the police generally protected the thugs who were terrorizing the strikers.
On by mass picketing in the face of violence and clubbings by the police and the special guards hired by the employers. Even though women workers made up a small minority of the strike force, they quickly assumed important positions in the strike organization. For example, Dora Landberg, who had grown up in the cloakmaking trade, enthusiastically directed the strike headquarters, where she coordinated the picketing. In addition, she dispatched aid to those arrested strikers who requested bail. 6 In contrast to the shirtwaist strike, the WTUL played only a peripheral role in the cloakmakers' revolt, mainly because women made up only a small percentage of the strikers. But John Deitch, the ILGWU's national secretary-treasurer, having learned something from the girls' strike, requested help from the League and named Helen Merritt and Leonora O'Reilly to the cloakmakers' strike committee. Every few days, Merritt visited the headquarters of the settlement committee where the national officers sat in session. The union leaders appointed Merritt and Schneiderman to negotiate a settlement with those manufacturers who employed female alteration hands. League members formed a milk committee which raised money and distributed 209,000 quarts of milk to strikers, children. 7. After efforts by the State Bureau of Arbitration to mediate the strike had failed, the association refused to enter into negotiations until the union agreed to state that it would not seek either recognition or the closed shop, which the union rejected. 8a. Lincoln Filene, the Boston department store owner and a leading member of the Boston branch of the National Civic Federation, contacted Louis D.
Brandeis and asked him to go to New York to help arrange a settlement of the strike.
As counsel for the Boston Cloak and Suit Manufacturers Association, Brandeis had helped to break a 4-month general strike there in 1907 by obtaining injunctions against the union leaders. 9 Now he appeared in New York as a friend of labor but an enemy of the closed shop, one of the union's main demands. Under Brandeis' clever and persuasive maneuvering, Deitch and the majority of the strike committee agreed to eliminate the closed shop from the list of the union's basic demands. But the more radical of the union's executive officers, as well as the majority of the rank and file, declined to accept arbitration without some consideration of the closed shop issue.
In fact, the active personal intervention of Samuel Gompers was needed before indignant union leaders and members would agree to enter into a conference with the employers on
July 28.10. The conference had little difficulty in coming to an understanding
about the specific grievances of the cloakmakers, but it could make no headway on the closed shop issue.
At this stage, Brandeis put forward the formula of the preferential union shop, which would bind an employer to give preference to an available union member in hiring, while still permitting him to hire non-union members and retain scabs.
Brandeis did not invent the preferential union shop.
Although Deitch thought the plan too new, it had been promulgated as a union demand in the 1892 strike of the AFL Teamsters, Scalemen, and Packers in New Orleans. 11 When the AFL was weak in fighting against the open shop drive, it put forward the preferential union shop as a step toward the closed shop. By 1910, However, when the closed shop had been won in many contracts, acceptance of the preferential union shop represented a retreat. Gompers, however, urged the union to accept it. 12 But with the Jewish
Daily Forward denouncing the preferential shop as the scab shop with honey, and with the New York Call urging the strikers to stick to their guns, Brandeis maneuverings got nowhere.
The mass of the workers rejected his proposal, and on August 3, the UNML annulled all joint conferences and renounced all offers of peace and arbitration, declaring,
"The rank and file of our organization demand the closed shop.
There can be no compromise on that score, and if we were to accept any compromise, the rank and file would not abide by our decision." 13. So vigorously did the strikers oppose any retreat on the closed shop issue that members of the strike committee who favored the preferential shop were actually threatened with violence. 14 But when the strike leadership, bowing to the determined opposition of the rank and file, rejected the agreement proposed by the association because it included the preferential union shop, Justice John W. Goff of the New York Supreme Court made the injunction against the strikers permanent. Goff labeled the strike a common law, civil conspiracy to obtain the closed shop and thereby to deprive non-union men and women of the opportunity to work and drive them out of the industry. The police were authorized to disperse all pickets, peaceful or otherwise. 5 inches for the first time in the history of labor disputes in the state, observes Graham Adams Jr., an injunction not only permanently restrained men from peaceful picketing but also forbade them to interfere in any way at all with those who wished to work. 16.
Even Julius Henry Cohen, the attorney for the manufacturers, described the injunction as the strongest one ever handed down by an American court against trade unionism, and the New York Evening Post, which seldom favored the cause of labor in any strike, criticized
Goff's injunction, commenting, "One need not be a sympathizer with trade union policy as it reveals itself today in order to see that the latest injunction, if generally upheld, would seriously cripple such defensive powers as legitimately belong to organized labor." 17 Speaking for the
AFL, Gompers called the decision another example of the tyranny of the autocratic methods of concentrated capital and greed. The New
York City Central Federated Union, in conjunction with the Socialist Party, organized a huge demonstration against this judicial tyranny. Meanwhile, negotiations were continuing, and on September 2, the manufacturers presented a new proposal for a settlement with additional concessions. The strike committee, with the support of only 200 hurriedly assembled shop chairmen and with a minimum of debate, ratified the first collective bargaining agreement in the industry. No public announcement was made of the agreement, nor were any public assemblies held before the ratification. 19. The Protocol of Peace, as the agreement was called, won for the workers, after 9 weeks of bitter struggle, a 50-hour week, bonus pay for overtime, 10 legal holidays, free electric power installation for machines, no home work, weekly pay in cash, not checks, limitations on overtime, a joint board of sanitary control to help clean up filthy shops, a committee of grievances and compulsory arbitration, with no strike or lockout permitted before arbitration, and price settlements to be made in each shop by negotiation. The settlement had tremendously important implications for unskilled women workers, since the agreement covered the wages and conditions of every worker in the trade, from the skilled tailors to the finishers. 20. Despite these important gains, however, the settlement was a disappointment to many strikers, and a large number of the rank and file disapproved of it. One reason was that instead of the closed shop, there was the preferential union shop. Furthermore, unlike the usual collective bargaining agreement, the protocol had no time limit. It could run indefinitely but could be terminated by either side at will. As a concession, the manufacturers agreed to exert preference only as between one union man and another. Non-union labor could only be hired when union help was unobtainable. The agreement also compelled employers to declare their belief in the union and in the ideal that all who desire its benefits should share its burdens. 21. But to many rank and file workers, all this was still only the scab shop with honey, and they disapproved, too, of the no-strike clause and the provision for compulsory arbitration. 22. Responding to this criticism, the union's official journal declared, It is far better to strike for, and win recognition of our union, than an increase in wages, or decrease of hours, without the powerful organization needed to maintain the conditions once created. With such an organization, the possibilities of the future are unlimited. 23. But events were soon to demonstrate that the union relied exclusively on the machinery of the protocol and the goodwill of the employers to establish permanent industrial peace and failed to build a strong organization in order to enforce it. As a result, the employers were able to freely violate the terms of the protocol.
The revolt in the garment trades next shifted to Chicago, where, on
September 22, 1910, a small group of courageous women ignited the spark which led 40,000 unorganized clothing workers to strike. The uprising began when a few girls employed in shop number 5 of Hart, Schaffner and Marx, the largest clothing factory in the city, walked off the job when their piece rate was arbitrarily cut from 4 cents to 31 cents a pair. One of these girls was Bessie Abramowitz, an immigrant from Grodno in White Russia, who had already been blacklisted in Chicago's clothing shops because of her militancy and was working at Hart. Schaffner and Marx under an assumed name. Under the leadership of Abramowitz and Annie Shapiro, 12 young women petitioned for a return to the old rate. When this appeal was rejected, they struck and sought help from the United Garment Workers, which had a small, male-dominated local of clothing cutters within the Hart, Schaffner and
Marx plant.
Uninterested in organizing young immigrant women, the elite local gave the strikers the brush off, whereupon the 14 young women started to picket by themselves. At first, they received little support from other workers in the plant, and it took 3 weeks of steady, day-by-day picketing by these 14 determined strikers to convince the other workers that this was not just a lark, but a serious effort to redress their long-standing grievances. By the 4th week, other workers in the plant, realizing that the pickets were fighting for them as well, joined the 14 women, and, by the middle of October, almost 8,000 Hart, Schaffner and Marx workers had walked out. The walkout gradually spread to other manufacturing houses until the entire industry was paralyzed. 24. With the United Garment Workers indifferent to their struggle, the strikers appealed to the Chicago Women's Trade Union League and the Chicago Federation of Labor for assistance. Both organizations responded instantly. However, the WTUL's National Executive Board had just established a definite strike policy requiring that any union requesting league assistance had to include 2 league members on its strike committee.
Pressured by the strikers, the UGW leadership agreed to this stipulation. 25 Thereupon the Chicago WTUL threw itself wholeheartedly into the strike.
Members formed 11 separate committees to handle picketing, publicity, speakers, benefit meetings, public events, and relief. They established headquarters in the same building that housed the Chicago Federation of Labor offices. 26. One of the original strikers explained why she and her colleagues had walked out. "We started to work at 7:30 and worked until 6 with 3/4 of an hour for lunch. Our wages were 7 cents for a pair of pants, or $1 for 14 pairs. For that we made 4 pockets and 1 watch pocket, but they were always changing the style of the stitching, and until we got the swing of the new style, we would lose time and money, and we felt sore about it. One day the foreman told us the wages were cut to 6 cents a pair of pants and the new style had 2 watch pockets. We would not stand for that, so we got up and left. 27. As in the New York strikes, the employers hired detectives and thugs and received the full support of the police. In fact, Chicago's police, long notorious for their brutality toward strikers, were even more barbarous than those in New York. By December, 2 of the strikers had been gunned down and killed by police bullets, and many more had been injured by club-swinging members of the force. Arrests of strikers occurred daily, and members of the League's picket committee patrolled the streets in order to serve as witnesses for strikers arrested without cause. League members also joined the strikers' picket lines and reviewed the rules for pickets with the strikers each day before they went picketing with them. 2s. After 40,000 garment workers, 10,000 of them women, had walked off the job, the strikers received a crippling blow from their own union. Thomas Rickert, president of the United Garment Workers, was a conservative, old-line labor leader, interested in developing the union along craft lines. Skeptical of the value of unskilled immigrants to the union, he was eager to come to terms with the employers. In November, he announced an agreement with Hart, Schaffner and Marx, but it was unanimously rejected by the strikers, who declared it wholly unacceptable. Asian of Labor learned that the UGW District No. 6 treasury was empty and that the union office's offer to assist the strikers lacked any substance. In fact, the union had issued worthless vouchers to over 10,000 people. A joint conference of officials of the Chicago Federation of Labor, league leaders, and UGW officers managed to raise $700. They then proceeded to distribute $3 for each $5 voucher to the angry strikers. 29 FHE strike revealed an extraordinary determination on the part of the strikers not to yield, in spite of hunger and cold. Jane Addams called it a spontaneous revolutionary movement. The more brutal the thugs and police became, the more determined the strikers were to hold out until the strike was 30 on. On November 5, Rickert reached an agreement with Hart, Schaffner and Marx for arbitration of all issues without union recognition. Once again, the workers rejected the proposal, and this time they made their hatred of the national officials so pronounced that Rickert had to leave the hall quickly by a back door. Thousands of striking cutters, trimmers, and spongers adopted a resolution stating that, "We repudiate the action of Thomas A. Rickert in signing any agreement without presenting the same for approval." Despite mounting violence against them, the final count was 374 strikers arrested and 2 killed. The workers, on December 8, again rejected an agreement that would have sent them back to work without union recognition. It took another 5 weeks of hunger, cold, and violence before the workers of Hart, Schaffner and Marx, on January 14, 1911, reluctantly agreed to go back to work and refer all issues to an arbitration committee. But the other 30,000 strikers maintained their ranks solidly until, on February 3, Rickert and his lieutenants, without consulting the strikers, the WTUL, or the officials of the Chicago Federation of Labor, declared the strike over. Workers returned to work without any agreement and with no method of adjusting the grievances that had driven them to strike. Those who had been the most militant of the pickets were refused employment when they tried to return to their former jobs. The 25-year-old Sidney Hillman, with Frank Rosenblum, Bessie Abramowitz, who later became Mrs. Hillman, and Sam Levin, had risen to leadership among the workers during the strike, and they recorded that the great majority of the strikers were forced to return to their old miserable conditions, through the back door, and happy were those who were taken back. Many were victimized for months afterwards. Members of the WTUL and the Chicago Federation of Labor who had worked tirelessly for a just settlement felt as betrayed as the strikers themselves. 31. Only the Hart, Schaffner and Marx workers operated under a contract as a result of the strike. This contract, drawn up by Clarence Darrow, the famed labor lawyer, who had volunteered his services in defense of the strikers, and company attorney Carl Meyer, is historically regarded as the first major victory in the annals of men's clothing workers' unionism. It established a minimum wage for various departments in the factory, a 54-hour week, and time and a half for overtime. It also presaged future occupational safety and health measures when it insisted that all tailor shops be properly ventilated, and that no sweeping of a character to raise dust in any of the shops be done during working hours. The agreement provided for overtime pay for extra work and initiated a permanent board of arbitration, composed of Darrow and Meyer, to hear and rule on future worker grievances. 32. The Cleveland garment strike of 1911 followed the pattern that had emerged in New York and Chicago. Strikers, men and women alike, held out for 10 long weeks to end low pay, unsanitary working conditions, inside subcontracting, and long and irregular hours. The strike began in June when 4,400 men and 1,600 women walked off the job demanding a 50-hour week, abolition of charges for supplies and electricity, elimination of subcontracting, union recognition, and a permanent joint wage committee composed of worker representatives, outside arbitrators, and employers for the purpose of establishing a uniform wage scale. As it had in New York and Chicago, union recognition became a crucial factor, and as in the former two cities, middle-class women lent invaluable support, while WTUL organizers rushed to the scene to offer assistance. 33. As in earlier strikes, too, the police came to the manufacturers' aid. But in Cleveland, they were even more brutal than elsewhere. The Cleveland Plain Dealer described an attack of the police on the girl strikers. The mounted police, galloped headlong at the crowd when they first appeared, and the hundreds who blocked the street fled in terror. They swung their clubs when they reached the crowd and forced their way through, driving scores before them down the streets. Some girls who ran from them were chased for blocks. As the police carried the young garment workers from the strike scene in the patrol wagons, the women joined in song to keep their spirits high. All we ask is bail. All we get is jail. All that we want is to fight. Until we get what is right. At one of the factories, 45 girls were arrested at one time. No sooner were they jailed than one of the girls proposed that a meeting be held there in prison, and resolutions were adopted condemning the police. As one observer noted, girls who maintain this fighting spirit in police cells are not going to be easily beaten. Pauline Newman, who had been sent to Cleveland by the ILWU to help the strikers, reported that the spirit manifested by the girl workers in Cleveland was an inspiration to the entire labor movement. 34. Unfortunately, the strike failed. As it dragged on into October, the Lanternational's funds fell dangerously low, and the Cleveland manufacturers found New York and Chicago shops to fill their orders. In desperation, the ILGWU turned to the AFL Executive Council for assistance, pleading. For 14 weeks the strikers have maintained their ranks unbroken. The strike has already cost over $250,000, almost all of which has been contributed by members and locals of the International. Ladies Garment Workers Union. The Cleveland strikers are ready to keep up the fight until the principle of collective bargaining is recognized by the employers. Be prompt with your aid lest the employers starve us into submission. But the AFL Executive Council remained deaf to the appeal. And so, writes Elizabeth McCreish, despite the strikers' heroism and valuable support from sympathizers and union officials, organized manufacturers succeeded in halting the union movement among Cleveland's garment workers. 35. Milwaukee's garment workers were more successful in their strike. There was a good reason for this. Of all the strikes of garment workers of the period, only the one in Milwaukee was not accompanied by police violence against and unjustified arrests and imprisonment of pickets. The chief reason for this difference was the election of Emil Seidel as socialist mayor of Milwaukee on the eve of the strike, which broke out late in November 1910. The police chief, a holdover from the previous administration, ordered the customary police brutality toward the pickets, whereupon Mayor Seidel addressed an official letter to him that went. Complaints have been made here that disemployed citizens have recently been subjected to abusive epithets and rough handling by policemen. Whatever may be the basis of these complaints, I want it understood that no man on the police force has the right to interfere with a citizen who is not violating the law. I expect you, as Chief of Police, to make clear to the members of your department that as long as a citizen is within his legal rights, he should not be manhandled or insulted. Risingtham will be accountable. Hoping that Rapon's referred to will, on investigation, prove to be exaggerated. Apparently the police got the message. Deprived of their usual allies, the manufacturers settled on December 9 on the basis of a 5-4-hour week, time and a half for overtime, double pay for holidays, an open door to the employers, over the heads of foremen, with complaints of ill treatment, and the appointment of a committee representing workers and employers to discuss a new wage scale and the issue of union recognition. 36*. The next major battle in the clothing industry was fought by the New York fur workers. In 1912, there were 10,000 workers in New York's fur manufacturing shops. About 7,000 of them were Jewish, practically all recent immigrants from Eastern Europe. The remainder included Germans, Greeks, Italians, French Canadians, English, Bohemians, Slovaks, and other nationalities. About 3,000 were women, mainly finishers. In April 1904, the International Association of Fur Workers of the United States and Canada was organized, but the union's failure to organize the Jewish furriers led to its collapse and the surrender of its charter to the AFL early in 1911. At that point, however, the United Hebrew Trades initiated an organizing drive, and by the spring of 1912, 3,000 of the 10,000 workers in the industry had been organized into 3 locals which affiliated with the AFL. With its enlarged membership and with $3,000 in its treasury, the union felt prepared for a major struggle with the employers. 37. The need for changes in the working conditions in the fur trade made the union confident that there would be a positive response to its call. The poverty-ridden life of immigrant workers in New York City, with its low wages, horrible surroundings, long months of unemployment, and the constant struggle to earn a living, was nowhere better illustrated than in the case of the fur workers. The majority of the cutters, the aristocrats of the trade, earned about $12 a week. Operators averaged only about $6, and finishers, all women, only $5. Most fur workers worked 6 to 60 hours a week, and some even longer. They worked these incredibly long hours in filthy, disease-breeding sweatshops, usually located in ancient, broken-down wooden tenements or in basements. In 1 or 2 small rooms, without even a pretense of ventilation, about 20 fur workers would labor. Stairs, hallways, rooms, and closets were packed with dust-saturated fur pieces and cuttings. Stench and dust blanketed everything. Hair, dust, and poisonous dyes ate at the workers' eyes, noses, skin, and lungs as they toiled at the bench or machine. In 1911, a New York State Commission conducted an investigation of sanitary conditions in fur shops. A special panel of doctors examined the workers. 2 out of every 10 fur workers had tuberculosis, and another 2 had asthma. The fingers of many workers were rotted by dyes. The skin on their hands had turned black. The commission reported that 8 out of every 10 fur workers were suffering from occupational diseases. 38. Little wonder, then, that the newly formed union was confident that there would be an enthusiastic response to its strike call. The union began its preparations for a general strike in the spring of 1912, quietly preparing for action and framing a set of demands. These included union recognition, the closed shop, a 9-hour day, the 54-hour week, paid holidays, the abolition of home work and subcontracting, and a union scale of wages. On June 14, 1912, union members were balloted on the strike issue. The final tabulation showed an overwhelming favorable majority, 2,135 for a general strike and only 364 against. 2 days later, the union sent its demands to the manufacturers. The answer of the employers was swift. On June 19, the 2 employers, associations, the Associated Fur Manufacturers and the Mutual Fur Protective Association, the latter composed of about 300 employers, rejected the union's demands. The fur manufacturers were resolved to oppose union recognition and the closed shop, and the MFPA determined not to enter into any contract, agreement or secret understanding that shall or may conflict with the principle of the open shop. 39. On June 20, the strike call was distributed in the fur market. As was the custom in all garment strikes of the period, the strike bulletin was printed in red, and was known as the Red Special. Calling on the fur workers to arise to battle, the Red Special declared, "Victory is positive. The general strike starts today, June 20, at 10 a.m. No one shall remain at work. Leave your shops as one man." Exactly at the appointed hour, 7,000 fur workers in 40 shops responded to the union's call. On the second day, 8,500 workers were out from 500 shops, 3/4 of them Jewish and 2,000 of them women. By the end of the first week, the strike was general in fact as well as in name. Only members of the German Furriers Union remained at work until the 5th week, at which time they, too, joined the strike. With 9,000 workers out, the trade was completely paralyzed. 40. With the entire trade at a standstill, the union leaders expected a brief, triumphant struggle. They felt that the employers had learned from the militancy and endurance demonstrated so recently by garment workers in their strikes. But it soon became evident that the fur workers were in for a long and bitter battle. Some small employers settled with the union during the first 3 weeks of the strike. The two employers' associations, however, were determined to fight to the end, and they were convinced that they could win by starving out the workers. The manufacturers would simply close their shops for 3 weeks, and on July 8, the shops would open for all workers to return under the old conditions. There was some justification for the employers' confidence. After the first 3 weeks of the strike, the union's financial resources were approaching the vanishing point, and many of the strikers were faced with starvation and eviction. But the women pickets marched around the buildings that housed the fur shops, carrying signs in Yiddish and English that read, "Masters, starvation is your weapon. We are used to starving. We will fight on, till victory." Carrying these signs, they struggled on day after day, going around the buildings from morning until night, with barely enough food to keep them going. As July 8 approached, the eyes of all New York were on the furriers, and the question was asked, would their ranks break? 9,000 strikers gave the answer that morning as they walked the picket lines of the fur district. Every shop remained empty. The strikers had won the first test. The Jewish Daily Forward paid tribute to them in a front-page editorial. "We have had many mass strikes, but the strike of the fur workers is a rare, golden chapter in the history of the Jewish labor movement." The bosses thought that the sudden opening of the shops would bring the workers back. But the workers remained firm and united. The Morning Sun saw the wonderful result of the common effort, one of the most memorable and heroic struggles in history. 41. 9 times during the next 10 weeks, the employers repeated their announcement that the shops would reopen. Each time, the strikers kept the shops closed by their militant demonstrations. "Not since the Great Triangle Protest March," wrote the New York Call on July 17, "was there a more impressive demonstration scene than the one of 9,000 fur workers which took place yesterday noon." As in all of the previous garment strikes, except the one in Milwaukee, the fur employers unleashed gangsters against the workers, and the police protected the strikebreakers by clubbing and arresting the pickets. More than 800 strikers were arrested, including 250 women, 54 workers, 40 of them women, received workhouse sentences, and 215, over 60 of whom were women, suffered serious injuries at the hands of the thugs. Despite these obstacles, the furriers remained steadfast. However, the union was compelled to issue an appeal to all sympathetic groups for funds. Fortunately, the response was generous. In order to aid the strikers financially, an aid committee was elected by the United Hebrew Trades. Rose Blank of the Women's Trade Union League and its delegate to the UHT was chosen chairperson of the committee. 42. Over $20,000 was raised through the Jewish Daily Forward. The Cloakmakers Union, itself the recipient of contributions from the fur workers during its great strike, contributed $20,000, and the cap makers, $1,500. Special strike issues of the Forward and the New York Call, Tag Day collections, house-to-house canvassing, picnics, and theater benefits netted additional funds. Lodges of fraternal organizations contributed $1,000. Other AFL unions raised another $1,000. But not 1 cent of the $60,000 raised and spent by the union in the course of the strike came from the national AFL. When Morris Shamroth, a member of the strike committee, went to the AFL Executive Council in Washington seeking financial assistance, Gompers sent him back with the message, "Tell the strikers to let the world know they are hungry and keep up the fight." 43. The tag days were operated by the Army of Women Strikers. Rose Blank wrote later, "Nothing stopped them. They went to saloons, restaurants, stores, amusement places and at dinner time, to shops. They stood the reprimands of their relatives, and even occasional insults. The girls were not disheartened, they kept on with their work." 44. Chairperson of the 2000 women strikers was Esther Polansky. Russian-born, she had changed her trade from dressmaker to fur finisher and was so militant in helping to organize the union that she was selected as a member of the Strike Arrangements Committee and then to head the women strikers. As chairperson, she won additional fame by her own example, because she herself never stopped considering when it was necessary to take down a shop or go up to a place where scabs worked. She never stopped Annie Tikolsky, who already bore 2 scars from police beatings in Warsaw, where she had organized textile workers, was severely beaten and arrested many times during the first strike. Life and Labor, Volume 2, December 1912, p. 361. Before any danger. This the workers appreciated so much that not only did she win their admiration but also their willingness to sacrifice if she ordered them to do so. 45. Toward the end of August, when the strike had been on for the better part of 2 months, negotiations finally got underway between the union and employer representatives. On August 22, at a specially arranged meeting of the strikers, the terms of a proposed settlement were read and explained. The strikers were granted nearly all of their demands, including union recognition. Only the closed shop and the demand for a half-day on Saturday throughout the year were omitted from the proposed agreement. The work week was to include a half-day on Saturday during the first 8 months of the year, but a full day on Saturday for the remaining 4 months. Socialist Meyer London, the strikers' legal advisor, was cheered when he urged them to stick to their demands. So, too, was Samuel Gompers. The strikers overlooked the callous advice he had given them when they appealed for financial assistance and demonstrated their approval of his statement. "Since you have rebelled, which is a sign that you no longer want to stand for it, stay out and keep up your fight until your employers yield to your demands." The strikers then affirmed by unanimous vote that they would not return to their jobs unless the employers granted them the half-holiday on Saturday all year round, instead of simply for the first 8 months. 2 weeks later, in the 13th week of the strike, victory was won. The strike ended on September 8 when the manufacturers acceded to the strikers' demand for the Saturday half-holiday. The fighting furriers, as the New York Call labeled the strikers, also obtained a 49-hour week, overtime work only during the busy season, at time and a half, 10 paid holidays, the banning of homework, wages to be paid weekly and in cash, a permanent board of arbitration and a joint board of sanitary control, a standing conference committee to settle all disputes, with 5 from each side and with an 11th and deciding member to be named jointly by both sides and union recognition. The agreement was to last for 2 years. The power of unity and solidarity triumphed over the power of money, the power of police attacks and hunger and want, declared the Jewish Daily Forward in hailing the victory. It was an historical agreement, the best thus far achieved in the revolt of the garment workers, and the first collective agreement in an industry in which there was not even a national union. For the AFL Charter to the International Fur Workers of the United States and Canada was not issued until July 1, 1913.46*. During the opening weeks of 1913, the New York garment workers in both the men's and women's branches were participating in tremendous labor uprisings. At one time, more than 150,000 workers in the trade were on strike: men's tailors, white goods workers, kimono and wrapper makers, and shirtwaist makers. "The local needle industries," exclaimed the New York Call in some astonishment on January 13, 1913, "have been practically paralyzed by one of the most gigantic and general uprisings which Greater New York has ever witnessed." 47. On January 6, 1913, Approximately 7,000 white goods workers, nearly one-half of the workers in the trade, went out on strike, demanding a 20% increase in wages, a flat 54-hour week. The abolition of child labor, of the fining system, and of subcontracting. And recognition of the union in a closed shop. Once on the picket lines, the strikers encountered the usual indiscriminate arrests, and the employers, thugs, beat up the young pickets, many of whom were little girls in short dresses and with hair down their backs. When WTUL members who accompanied the strikers on picket duty issued public protests against the employers, thugs, the bosses adopted a new tactic. Into the battle came the gangsters, malls. They filled their pocketbooks with stones, and when a skirmish began, they swung their loaded bags against the pickets' heads. They also carried concealed scissors, and at an opportune moment, they would cut the strikers' long braided hair. In addition, they dogged the strikers' steps, keeping up a steady barrage of obscenities and urging them to join their ranks, with promises of easy money and good times. 48. But the picket lines held fast, and as the 15-year-old girls walked the lines, they sang the Song of the White Goods Workers, to buoy their spirits. At last all New York's white goods toilers just stopped the life of slavery and went to join the golden soil of the Union's bravery. Now we're all doing our duties, the spell of slavery to break, and the boss's wife shall pawn the rubies to get herself a Union cake. We're getting beaten by policemen with their heavy clubs of hickory, but we'll fight as hard as we can to win strong Union victory. 49. As in the Great Uprising of 1909-1910, prominent society women took up the strikers' cause, although not this time in association with the WTUL, marching on the picket lines, holding benefit functions, assisting in police court, posting bond, and generally focusing public attention on the strikers' plight and their bravery. These women developed an enormous admiration for the white goods workers' courage and determination. Other prominent figures, too, took up the strikers' cause. Theodore Roosevelt paid a whirlwind visit to the strike scene and announced his shock over the girls' working conditions and the treatment the future mothers of America had received during the strike. Fola Follett, daughter of the progressive senator from Wisconsin, picketed with the striking girls, along with college students from Barnard and Wellesley. Victor Berger, the socialist congressman from Milwaukee, called for a federal investigation into clothing industry conditions. And New York City Mayor William Gaynor warned employers against the use of strong-arm methods. After League members and their striking colleagues had brought 25 cases of false arrest before Police Commissioner William Baker, the latter changed a number of officers and reprimanded others for their treatment of the young strikers. 50. The white goods workers ended their strike on February 18, 6 weeks after it had begun, with an agreement that was negotiated with the assistance of Rose Schneiderman and Viola Shore, in which the Cotton Manufacturers Association agreed to specified improvements in working conditions. Hours were reduced from 60 a week to 52, charges for power and materials were abolished, subcontracting was ended in the association shops. There were pay increases for both week and piece workers, plus extra pay for overtime, and 4 legal holidays annually with pay. In addition, the contract established a wage floor. No worker was to work for less than $5.00 a week. While the manufacturers refused to agree to a closed shop, they did consent to negotiate with shop chair ladies whenever a disagreement occurred. The girls had hoped for a closed shop, and at one point during the 6-week strike, the workers had voted to continue the struggle until such an agreement could be reached. However, the association members would only accept the preferential union shop, agreeing to give union members preference when hiring. While many girls raised violent objections to the settlement, claiming that it should have at least included a protocol agreement, the majority eventually voted to accept the contract at an emotion-filled mass meeting. St. The women of wrapper, kimono, and house dress workers Union, Local 41 walked out on January 8, 1913, and a week later, the leaders of Dress and Wastemakers Union, Local 25 issued a call for their second general strike. The Wastemakers walkout, involving 25,000 waste and dressmakers, ended 3 days later, on January 18, with the acceptance of a protocol for the industry that provided for new wage scales, a 50-hour week, improved sanitary conditions, union recognition, and the establishment of arbitration boards to deal with workers' grievances. 52 The strike of the wrapper, kimono, and house dress. Workers' union lasted longer. Amid desperate personal sacrifices, the women strikers refused to accept any agreement that did not provide for union recognition. On February 13, 1913, however, the Manufacturers Association, feeling the pressure of public support for the strikers, signed a Protocol of Peace with Local 41.53. By the middle of March, 1913, every branch of the ladies' garment industry in the most important center of that industry, New York City, had contractual relations with the ILGWU, which were based more or less on the Cloakmakers Protocol of 1910, and similar agreements were being signed in Boston and other centers. By year's end, these trade agreements covered 90% of the Lanternational's membership. 54. The greatest of all the struggles in the wave of organizational strikes in the garment trades, which began with the shirtwaist strike in 1909, was the New York general strike of more than 100,000 workers in the men's clothing industry. Supporting men's clothing workers' strikes broke out also in Rochester, Buffalo, and Philadelphia. Unorganized largely because of the indifference of the United Garment Workers leadership, these workers had seen their wages falling while the cost of living rose. Then suddenly, realizing that the workers had been inspired by the struggles of the wastemakers, cloakmakers, and furriers, and were ready to fight, and that they had to give at least token support to their determination to achieve better conditions, the UGW leaders indicated a willingness to go along. On November 15, 1912, after a series of organizational meetings, the New York District Council of the Union issued a call for a general strike of the entire clothing industry of Greater New York, and predicted that out of it, a mighty tailors' union will be built up. 55. When the tailors voted 35,786 for and only 2,322 against the general strike, the official call was issued for the walkout to begin on December 30. By the end of the first week, it was conceded that more than 100,000 workers were on strike in the largest of all the struggles in the garment trades that had begun with the shirtwaist strike in 1909. Of the 100,000 strikers, fully one-third were women, the majority of whom were Jewish and Italian, with Poles, Russians, Lithuanians, Greeks, Germans, Czechs, and other nationalities making up the rest. On January 6, 1913, the Union announced the beginning of mass picketing, headed by a picketing committee of 10,000 strikers, to secure the following demands: a general 20% wage increase, a 48-hour week, union recognition, extra pay for overtime, electric power for machines, abolition of tenement house work, and improved sanitary conditions in the shops. The significance of the last demand is indicated by the fact that F. Rannes Perkins, executive secretary of the Committee of Safety and in 1933 selected to be the first woman Secretary of Labor, described the workshops and factories of the clothing industry as fire and death traps. The lessons of the triangle fire have not been learned by the employers. 56. The workers did not have sufficient funds to provide sustenance for themselves and their families during New York's bitter winter. They faced the savagery of strikebreakers, thugs, and police. Daily reports read: blood flowed freely, skulls were cracked, ribs were broken, eyes blackened, teeth knocked out, and many persons were otherwise wounded in a brutal assault on the garment strikers and pickets, not by the hired thugs and gangsters, but by the Cossacks, who comprise a part of the New York City police force. As in the past strikes, the judiciary did what it could for the manufacturers, and when the strikers defied state Supreme Court injunctions outlawing peaceful picketing, hundreds of them were arrested. 57. The strikers' militancy, combined with mounting support from the public and from the labor and socialist movements, forced individual firms to settle. On January 21, the Clothing Contractors Association, speaking for itself and for the United Merchants and Manufacturers Association, agreed to enter into a conference with the UGW for the purpose of devising a means of settling the strike. At this point, UGW President Thomas Rickert stepped into the situation, and, as he had previously done in Chicago, disregarded both the strike leadership and the workers and accepted an agreement to end the strike. The strike leaders, bitter over this sellout, rejected the settlement. But when, on the last day of February, the three largest associations of clothing manufacturers submitted a proposal for settling the strike, Rickert again ignored both the strike committee and the strikers and promptly accepted the offer. Under this latest proposal, the workers were to return to their jobs immediately pending an impartial investigation into the issue of reducing hours. The tailors were to obtain a general wage increase of $1 per week, with a proportional raise for piece workers. Sanitary conditions would be somewhat improved, subcontracting would be abolished, and there was to be no discrimination in the reemployment of the strikers. Even though there was not a word about union recognition in any form, the UGW officially proclaimed the walkout at an endpoint 5/8. With the struggle already weakened by injunctions, police brutality, and arrests, the strikers were set back further when the Jewish Daily Forward suddenly reversed itself, lined up with Rickert, and urged the strikers to accept the settlement and return to their jobs. Then on March 7, with Rickert officially declaring the strike at an end, and with Mayor Gaynor, acting with Rickert's express authorization, ordering the police to disperse all remaining pickets, the strike faltered. On March 11, 1913, it ended. While the persistence and militancy of the workers produced a better agreement than either of the ones accepted by Rickert, the work week was reduced to 53 hours up to January 1914, and to 52 hours thereafter for all but cutters, who were to enjoy a 50-hour week too. January 1914, and not more than 48 hours thereafter, along with a small wage increase. It was the only one of the garment strikes in which the final settlement did not contain at least some form of union recognition. 59. However, the strike did encourage a number of workers in the trade to organize, and the underhanded, strike-breaking tactics of the UGW officials were to have important repercussions. 3 days after the strike was ended, Isaac A. Howard wrote in the New Review, a left-wing socialist monthly, the work of building up a permanent organization of the tailors must now begin. If they are to profit by the lesson of this strike, they must rid themselves of boss rule, by Rickert and his henchmen, if need be, by cutting loose from the national organization. 60. As a matter of fact, the strike paved the way for the 1914 rupture in the UGW and the resulting formation of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, bringing with it a brighter future for all workers in the men's clothing trade. For several years, two factions within the UGW had vied for power. Lager and Rickert, the UGW's top leaders, were enthusiastic advocates of Samuel Gomper's pure and simple unionism. They ran the union on business principles and carried this concept so far that they made a private business of selling the union label, even to firms that operated with non-union workers and ran their shops and factories as they pleased. Frowning upon strikes and depending on the union label for their bargaining strength, the UGW leaders placed their main reliance on workers who lived in small communities and worked in large factories manufacturing overalls. A large section of their supporters were Native American women, and Margaret Daly was the link between the conservative union leadership and these women, visiting each local annually to negotiate a new label contract. The other faction of the UGW was made up of tailors and operators who worked in the large urban shops. A great majority of these workers were of immigrant origin, most frequently Yiddish-speaking Eastern Europeans. The U.S.-born women in the small communities felt they had little in common with these workers in the urban centers, and the UGW leadership took advantage of this alienation by directing repeated sneering remarks at the non-English-speaking tailors in the big cities. They even encouraged the women in several UGW urban locals to complain to the WTUL about the fact that the Yiddish-speaking men were practically crowding out the women, who did not understand Yiddish. UGW officers made few attempts to organize the other urban centers, and when the tailors in the big cities struck, the leaders refused to acknowledge their strikes as legitimate. Then, When the workers refused to abandon the struggle, the UGW leaders invariably sabotaged the strike by arranging secret settlements. The tailors in the UGW called for a new unionism that combined industrial unionism, class consciousness, and socialism. While they wanted to change the entire structure of society, they also understood the need for waging the struggle for such immediate demands as higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions. They bitterly resented the corrupt class collaborationist policies of the national and local officials, and were enraged by the irresponsible use of the label by these officials and by their intimate relationship with the manufacturers. Above all, they resented the fact that a minority of the membership, the overall makers, were being used by the autocratic leaders as a means of maintaining their domination of the Union. 61. In 1914, 13 New York locals in the coat-making trade formed the United Brotherhood of Tailors. The New York tailors and related workers in Chicago, Baltimore, and Rochester now represented a clear majority of the total UGW membership, sufficient to control the approaching biennial convention and wrest the leadership from the conservative leaders. But Rickard and Lager were determined to remain in power regardless of the will of the majority of the membership. They therefore scheduled the convention to be held in Nashville, a site far removed from any of the large urban centers and a city administered by officials sympathetic to the UGW leaders. A few weeks before the convention, the union's auditor announced that a number of locals in New York and Chicago had fallen into financial arrears and were therefore ineligible to send delegates to the convention. 62. However, the New York tailors had a full delegation of 107 of the 350 delegates present when the convention opened and distributed a leaflet appealing for their right to be seated. It concluded with a firm plea for unity. Let us unite in order to fight our common enemy, capitalism, instead of picking suicidal quarrels among ourselves. 63. Rickard, however, brushed aside this and other attempts to compromise the differences between the two groups. He surreptitiously circulated a rumor that the Jews from New York were planning to subvert the Union and turn it into an instrument of the Jewish people. Not a single delegate from New York received credentials. 64. The excluded delegates moved to the balcony to witness the proceedings while others on the floor challenged the conservative leaders. Two women led the battle on both sides. Bessie Abramowitz, an authorized delegate from Chicago, worked tirelessly whipping up support for the excluded delegates. She shared the platform with fellow Chicagoans. Frank Rosenblum and A. D. Marimpetri as they addressed the convention and fought for the reinstatement of the 107 suspended delegates. Margaret Daly, a member of the union's executive board, lobbied for the conservative leadership. She spoke to the women delegates and sought to dispel any sympathy they might have for the suspended delegates, telling them that they were anarchists and Jews who were determined to disrupt the union. At a special meeting of women delegates which she called, Daly pictured the dissidents in the union as dangerous to the United States as well as to the UGW, and instructed the women to vote against the New Yorkers in the interests of their nation, their families, and their union. 65. The convention finally split apart when the tailors from New York, Chicago, Baltimore, and Rochester authorized and unauthorized delegates alike left the convention hall and regrouped at their hotel.
Tional officers.
Bessie Abramowitz proposed Sidney Hillman, then serving in New York as clerk for the Cloak and Suit Protocol, as president. Once the convention designated Hillman, Abramowitz pleaded with him to leave his New York job and accept the presidency. She wired him, "Understand that personal pledges must cease when sister organization at stake. To become a martyr, I urge you to accept the office." Hillman eventually did accept. 66. At the AFL convention in November 1914, delegates appeared from both factions of the United Garment Workers, each claiming to represent the union.
The fact that the anti-Rickard forces represented the great majority of the men's clothing workers was ignored by the AFL's
Credentials Committee, which seated Rickard and his followers on the ground that they were the regularly and officially elected delegates of the union. Gompers promptly sent a circular to all locals of the United Garment workers informing them that Rickert was the only president of the union, and that the organization he headed was the sole bona fide union of men's clothing workers affiliated with the AFL. 67 Ellen Gates. Starr commented angrily. The hand which should have been the strongest and readiest to aid those brave and oppressed people who had rejected the existing leadership of the United Garment Workers was the one which shut off from them the most powerful sources of aid. And why? Because a spirited body of people, unable to rid themselves, otherwise, of corrupt officials, had dared to secede in overwhelming majority and form a new and clean organization under honest and able leadership. 68. The New and Clean organization was formed at a special convention held by the insurgents in New York from December 26 to 28, 1914. Having lost in court the right to use the old union's name, the insurgents called themselves the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, with Sidney Hillman of Chicago as president and Joseph Schlossberg of New York as general secretary. The union then represented 40,000 workers in the United States and Canada. 69. The ideology of the new industrial union, a union born in militant struggle against the clothing employers and the bureaucrats of the UGW, was set forth clearly in the preamble to its constitution, which took note of the fact that there was a constant and unceasing struggle between those who owned the means of production and the class which had nothing but its labor power. The union was characterized as a natural weapon of offense and defense in the hands of the working class. Craft unions were called outdated, and only industrial unionism was considered able to meet the needs of the workers in the 20th century. The preamble called for the eventual organization of the working class both economically and politically, and looked forward to the time when working class organization would put the organized working class in actual control of the system of production, and the working class will then be ready to take possession of it. 70.